In the velvet shadows of royal courts, power wasn't the only thing passed down through bloodlines, so were obsessions. Behind jeweled crowns and sacred titles hid cravings that no history book dares to diagram. From emperors who married their lookalikes to kings who built thrones for their lovers dead or alive, these weren't just rulers, they were fetishists with armies, and their secrets didn't die with them. They were embalmed, perfumed, and crowned. So, pour a drink, dim the lights, because tonight we are peeling back the silk sheets of history's most unholy monarchs. Welcome to 30 Royals Obsessed with Strange Sexual Fetishes. Before we dive headfirst into this royal rabbit hole, make sure you're subscribed, because we dig up the stories history tried to bury. And while you're here, drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it over there? Midnight? Lunch break? A suspiciously long bathroom trip? We won't tell. Let's begin. Joanna of Castile. The story begins with a woman walking beside a coffin. No court, no crown, just her, the cold night air, and the carefully embalmed corpse of a man who had once been her husband. She insisted he was still beautiful, still warm, still hers, and in her own way soaked in grief, obsession, and royal delusion he was. Joanna of Castile was not born mad. That part came later, like a storm that arrives quietly and then refuses to leave. Before she was known as La Loca, she was a brilliant child, highly educated, fluent in multiple languages, intellectually curious. She questioned the church, memorized classical texts, and could go toe-to-toe with any theologian who dared challenge her. Spain, however, had little use for sharp daughters, so they married her off to a man whose cheekbones could cause diplomatic incidents. Philip the Handsome. A name like a perfume, a face like a dagger, and a libido that could bankrupt a monastery. Philip was, to put it delicately, not the faithful type. He treated marriage like a seasonal accessory, useful at court, stifling in private. Joanna, on the other hand, fell headfirst into obsession. The kind of love that doesn't bloom so much as burn. When he slept with other women, she reportedly flew into jealous rages. When he ignored her, she collapsed into sobbing fits. When he paid her attention, she latched on like a drowning woman clutching driftwood. And then he died. Suddenly. At 28. Heart failure, they said. Poison, some whispered. Joanna didn't believe any of it. What she believed was this: if she could just keep his body near, she could hold off the horror of being alone. So she did what any reasonable 16th century widow with unchecked royal authority might do. She refused to bury him. She had his body embalmed, placed in a lead-lined coffin, and began a journey across Spain ostensibly to find a suitable burial place, but actually just to stay near the one person who had ever made her feel alive, even in death. She slept beside the coffin. She opened it periodically to make sure he was still beautiful. She forbade other women from coming near it, out of fear they might try to seduce the corpse. Monks and guards alike reported strange, whispered conversations between Joanna and the box. Imagine the court's discomfort. You're a nobleman sent to escort your queen through the countryside, only to find she's singing lullabies to her dead husband's decaying body like it's bedtime in a royal nursery. No one knew how to stop her. No one dared. Over time, the situation stopped being tragic and started becoming something else. Something deeper, darker, and harder to name. Was it madness? Was it trauma? Was it an erotic grief so consuming it made reality optional? This wasn't just a widow in mourning. This was a monarch enacting a private ritual of refusal, refusal to let go, refusal to bury, refusal to accept the ordinary rules of life and death. In Joanna's world, love was eternal. Even if the flesh wasn't her own father, Ferdinand II, eventually had her confined under the polite fiction of protecting her legacy. They locked her away in a convent in Tordesillas. She lived there for 46 years, a ghost inside her own history. The coffin, at some point, was taken from her. But the legend had already crystallized. The queen who loved too hard, too long, too far. Was Joanna mad? Maybe, maybe not. Historians love to debate it. But madness is often just a word men use when women behave in ways that can't be explained, managed, or tolerated. What we do know is this: she turned her sorrow into something sacred. Monstrous, yes, but sacred. She loved beyond the bounds of reason, and that terrified everyone. You can sterilize it with psychology, wrap it in diagnoses, but you can't unfeel the strangeness of it. The woman, the coffin, the obsession that outlived its object. And when you think that's the peak of royal erotic dysfunction, history kindly whispers, we're just getting started. Because the next story isn't about grief. It's about a man whose body actively revolted at the idea of pleasure, whose bloodline cracked under the weight of courtly expectation, and whose very existence raises the question, what if your legacy depends on doing the one thing you physically can't? Emperor Jing of Han. In the palatial stillness of Han Dynasty China, where even the sound of a silk robe brushing against marble could carry political weight, the imperial family sat on a throne built on two things: order and reproduction. Dynasties do not run on virtue, they run on heirs, which made the problem of Prince Tuan not just personal, but existential. He was the son of Emperor Jing, 6th Emperor of the Western Han. A man remembered for stabilizing the empire, reducing harsh punishments, and fathering a boy who may have been incapable of the one thing an heir is required to do: continue the line. Now, in an empire where everything from the alignment of stars to the productivity of rice paddies was interpreted as a reflection of the emperor's moral order, a sexually non-functional heir was not just a medical curiosity. It was a cosmic embarrassment. We have, of course, no video evidence, no medical charts, no confessional scrolls. What we do have is rumor carved into history accounts that describe Prince Tuan as unable to perform his obligations with women, that he became physically ill at the suggestion, not shy, not reluctant, ill. As in pale-faced, hand-trembling, heart-racing, stomach-churning distress, the body saying no, regardless of what duty demanded. He wasn't just uninterested, he was repelled. Court officials, naturally, began to panic. There were quiet interventions, subtle pressures, elegant concubines presented like offerings on lacquered trays, and each time, the prince recoiled not with scandalized defiance, but with what witnesses described as sheer physiological discomfort. This wasn't rebellion, it was malfunction. And now the narrative fractures, because when you're dealing with royal history filtered through layers of state censorship, cultural taboo, and later Confucian revisionism, the facts get fuzzier than an ink-stained scroll. Some historians argue that Prince Tuan may have been queer. Others suggest trauma. A few whisper about rare genetic conditions or disorders of endocrine function. But what they all agree on is this: the imperial court didn't know what to do with him. In a world where even a eunuch's job involved more sexual politics than most modern dating apps, the idea of an imperial heir with no appetite for sex was something of a bureaucratic crisis. Officials began to debate whether he should be passed over in the line of succession. Others feared a scandal. After all, what kind of empire couldn't produce a functioning heir? But Emperor Jing didn't lash out. He was known for being mild-tempered, thoughtful, slow to punish. He reportedly protected Tuan, at least for a while, shielding him from court gossip and pushing off the question of succession until it became unavoidable. Some say the emperor believed in fate, that if heaven had willed this complication, it would be heaven who solved it. Others say he simply couldn't bear to humiliate his son. Tuan, for his part, vanished from prominence. He never ruled, never married, officially, never left behind any children. He existed like a ghost in the imperial record present, but untouched. A near mythical figure of absence, whose most famous trait was the thing he could not bring himself to do. And yet, in a cruel twist, history often judges him less for what he couldn't do, and more for what that said about the system he was born into. Because in the end, Prince Tuan may not have been broken. It may have been the palace that was. Think about it. What kind of world insists that the value of a person, especially a royal, is measured entirely by their capacity to perform an act that their own body refuses? And not just measured, but defined, institutionalized, judged? In another life, Tuan might have been a monk, a philosopher, a man who lived in quiet gardens and wrote poems about the wind brushing through bamboo. Instead, he was a prince expected to produce bodies when his own was locked in a civil war of nerves and shame. So the question lingers. What does it mean when a royal legacy hinges not on character or leadership, but on involuntary biology? The Han dynasty moved on. The empire endured. But somewhere in the labyrinth of time, the story of a prince who simply couldn't continues to echo. A royal who, in a society built around duty, became a symbol of the one duty he could never fulfill. And if that feels like an odd and lonely chapter in history, brace yourself. Because next comes a man who fulfilled his duties with extravagant enthusiasm. A man who turned royal leisure into industrial-scale debauchery. A man whose furniture still haunts museums and whose bathtub may have required its own wine cellar. You've met the prince who couldn't Now meet the king who couldn't stop. If you're still here after that, you're exactly our kind of people. Go ahead and hit subscribe, because this channel is basically a history degree, with better lighting and worse morals. And hey, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it right now? Are we your midnight companion or your Monday distraction? Either way, we see you. Let's keep going. King Edward VII. Before he was Edward VII, King of the United Kingdom and Emperor of India, he was simply Bertie, the perpetually disappointing heir to Queen Victoria. She once described him as idle, unfeeling, and selfish, which, coming from a woman who wore black for 40 years out of spite, might actually have been her version of affection. But Bertie didn't want to rule. Not really. What he wanted was to indulge, and indulge he did. While Victoria grieved the death of Prince Albert with enough public mourning to fog up every window in the empire, her son was busy becoming a legend in the underworld of European high society. His education? Neglected. His military career? Brief and ornamental. His public image? A mixture of scandal and silk. The man could wear a tuxedo like it was stitched directly onto his bloodstream, but the real legacy of Edward VII lies not in his policies, of which there were few, but in his furniture. Specifically, a chair. Not just any chair, a custom-built, leather-padded, mechanically reinforced contraption known as the siège d'amour, or, with far less subtlety, the love chair. Created in Paris by a furniture maker who clearly took commissions in whispers, the chair was reportedly designed to allow Edward corpulent, aging, and unapologetically hedonistic to comfortably participate in the social activities of the day without suffering cardiac arrest or a slipped disc. Think stirrups, hand grips, reinforced frame, plush seating, and enough gilding to make Versailles blush. Now, was the chair built for medical reasons? Some argue yes. The man was nearly 300 pounds by midlife and prone to breathlessness after climbing stairs. But to reduce it to a back support device is like calling the Mona Lisa a doodle. The truth is far stranger. Edward had engineered comfort into decadence, leisure into architecture. The royal body, at last, given permission to recline into vice with ergonomic precision. He didn't do this in secret, mind you. His private life was about as private as a fireworks show. The king bathed in champagne, dined on 10-course meals before heading into private salons. He was a fixture at the Parisian brothel Les Chabonnets, where he had not just a regular room, but his own suite, complete with murals, a royal crest, and that infamous chair, perched like a throne for the empire of appetite. And this wasn't just carnal tourism. Edward moved through these spaces with the bored entitlement of someone who had nothing left to prove and too much time to spend not proving it. He wasn't chasing thrills, he was chasing comfort. Predictable, indulgent, meticulously padded comfort. While the empire worried about rising unrest in the colonies, Edward worried about whether the caviar was adequately chilled. And yet, he was loved. Oddly, deeply, enduringly loved by the public. When he finally ascended to the throne at the age of 59, after the longest apprenticeship in British history, he surprised everyone by becoming a halfway decent king, diplomatic, smooth, politically neutral, inoffensive in public, scandalous in private, the perfect modern monarch. But his furniture spoke volumes. Because in a world where royals were expected to be austere, restrained, symbols of public virtue, Edward carved out a new identity, the Pleasure King. Not a ruler of morality, but a curator of indulgence. He didn't rebel against duty, he simply outweighted it. He turned his vices into interior decorating. And this wasn't a man overcome by lust. This was a man who approached sex like an accountant approaches a ledger. Scheduled, financed, regulated, and exquisitely upholstered. The Victorian era tried to pretend desire didn't exist. Edward VII made it into home decor. But even that, in hindsight, was tame compared to what came before. Because while Edward installed furniture for the sake of sensual comfort, his Roman predecessor installed policy. The next man didn't indulge behind closed doors. He turned the empire itself into an erotic theater. Sisters, senators' wives, dinners that became performances, and performances that became law. Edward built a chair. Caligula built an empire of appetite. Caligula. If excess had a patron saint, it would be Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, or, as history remembers him with a mixture of fascination and revulsion, Caligula. He was born into power, raised in the shadow of emperors, and adored as a child mascot of the Roman army nicknamed Little Boots for the tiny soldier's uniform he wore while toddling around military camps. It was cute then. Less cute when Little Boots grew up and turned the Roman Empire into a personal carnival of contradictions, compulsions, and calculated chaos. At first, Caligula was a breath of fresh air. After the long brooding reign of Tiberius, more on him soon, Rome wanted warmth, charm, entertainment. And for a brief moment, Caligula delivered. He cut taxes, freed political prisoners, staged games, public feasts, spectacles of generosity. Rome cheered. Then came the fever. Historians disagree on the details: malaria, poisoning, epilepsy, or perhaps an undiagnosed psychological break, But something snapped inside Caligula less than a year into his reign. He recovered in body, but not in mind. When he returned to the Senate, he did not thank the gods. He declared himself one. And that's when the empire started to tremble, not from war or invasion, but from confusion. Because Caligula didn't just rule, he performed rule. Every day became a pageant. Every act, a piece of theater designed to confuse, provoke, or horrify. He turned the imperial palace into what some scholars call the deification of dysfunction. There were lavish banquets held in the middle of the night, senators required to dance, sing, or grovel on cue. Public punishments delivered like slapstick routines, and at the heart of it all, Caligula smiling, drunk on power, and disturbingly pleased with his own unpredictability. Now, about those rumors. They swirl around Caligula like wine around a goblet. Indulgences with his sisters, elaborate staged couplings in front of courtiers, seduction of senators' wives followed by public critique of their performance. Was it real? Was it rumor? Was it Rome's chronic love for salacious slander? It doesn't matter. Because Caligula wanted you to believe it. That was the point. He didn't need to be believed in order to be feared. He only needed to be unpredictable. In that way, his perversity wasn't personal, it was political. A performance designed to unsettle, to destabilize the careful choreography of court life. If he was willing to violate every norm of family, decorum, and decency, then what, exactly, was safe? He blurred every line. Private became public. Decency became theater. Morality became mood. And Rome, despite itself, watched in morbid awe. The accounts say he made his horse a priest. Others say he tried to appoint it a consul. The truth? Probably somewhere in between. But again, that's not the point. The point is that people believed he might. That's how you rule through fear, not with iron, but with absurdity. The Senate was humiliated. The people bewildered. The palace hollowed out into a stage. And on that stage, Caligula played not a man but a god with a twisted sense of irony. He built golden statues of himself, forced citizens to worship him, made prayers compulsory, and, if the ancient sources are to be believed, took pleasure in testing the limits of loyalty with increasingly bizarre demands. Even his assassins didn't know what line he'd crossed, only that he must have crossed something. In the end, it took a conspiracy of palace guards and senators to bring the curtain down. They stabbed him in a hallway, reportedly while he was on his way to another performance. Whether for politics, revenge, or finally just exhaustion, Rome had had enough. And yet, like all good anti-heroes, Caligula left behind a legacy not of policy or conquest, but of questions. Was he mad? Was he method acting? Was the entire reign a cautionary tale, or a masterclass in weaponizing rumor? Historians argue, psychologists speculate, but here's what remains uncomfortably clear. Caligula understood the primal truth of power. That fear isn't born from strength, it's born from unpredictability. And nothing is more unpredictable than a man who makes vice look like virtue, and virtue look like a punchline. He blurred sacred lines until the audience stopped clapping and started praying. But before you assume Rome had hit bottom, consider this. The emperor who followed him didn't simply indulge in debauchery. He institutionalized it. He turned his private island into a blueprint for pleasure, funded by the empire, decorated in allegory, and enforced with silence. Caligula built a palace of performance. Tiberius built a fortress of secrets. Tiberius. Before Caligula transformed Rome into a stage for imperial theater, there was Tiberius, the man who taught him how to turn silence into spectacle. But unlike his flamboyant successor, Tiberius didn't shout. he whispered. And the empire listened carefully, because when Tiberius whispered, people disappeared. Born into chaos, trained in war, and adopted into the imperial machine by Augustus himself, Tiberius was never meant to be Rome's favorite. He was brilliant, yes, tactician, administrator, orator, but warm? Never. Even as a boy, his personality was described as remote, his eyes unreadable, his loyalty reserved for his ambitions. Rome didn't adore him, but Rome obeyed him. He was a man allergic to crowds, drawn to shadows, which made his eventual retreat from public life oddly fitting. In 26 AD, just over a decade into his reign, Tiberius left Rome. Not for a week, not for rest. He left permanently, retreating to the island of Capri, a jagged rock of seclusion in the Bay of Naples. Officially, it was for health. Unofficially, it was a controlled vanishing act. The Emperor of Rome had removed himself from Rome itself and ruled from a villa carved into cliffs and silence. Capri, to the casual eye, was paradise. Sun-drenched terraces, marble columns, vine-covered courtyards with views that stretched into myth. But to those who knew what Tiberius was building, it was less a villa and more a psychological fortress. Because behind those walls, according to the ancient sources, things began to bend. The accounts, chiefly from Suetonius and Tacitus, paint the island not as a sanctuary, but as a surreal inversion of Roman morality, public dignity on the mainland, private obsession offshore. The details in these texts are breathless, dramatic, and arguably inflated. But again, the goal wasn't always accuracy. The goal was legacy, and in the case of Tiberius, the legacy stuck. He didn't just withdraw. He curated a world where everything, pleasure, punishment, paranoia, answered only to him. What is known, with less theatricality but equal weight, is that Capri became a site of systematic secrecy. Visitors were carefully chosen, servants rarely returned. The island became a labyrinth of power plays, where the only rule was that Tiberius didn't need to explain himself. The emperor communicated with the Senate through letters icy, formal dispatches sent across the sea like messages from Olympus. Decisions of life and death were rendered from a marble chair with a sea view. Accusations, exiles, executions, all managed remotely, as if governance were a correspondence hobby. It wasn't just withdrawal, it was surveillance from a distance, emotional detachment raised to imperial policy. And yet, even in absence, Tiberius controlled the narrative. Roman elites, stripped of access, began to invent explanations, whispers of madness, of grotesque indulgence, of perverse rituals held behind closed doors. Was it true? Some of it, maybe none of it. But when a man makes himself invisible, people tend to draw monsters in the shadows he leaves behind. The rumors grew louder than his proclamations. Capri, the Mediterranean retreat, morphed in the Roman imagination into something closer to a Gothic palace. They said Tiberius filled it with erotic murals, surrounded himself with hand-picked youths, and hosted performances more theatrical than legal. Whether these are exaggerations or accurate portrayals of a deeply unhinged court, we will never know. And Tiberius never bothered to correct the record. That's the genius, or perhaps the danger, of silence. When you don't speak, your enemies write your biography. And Rome had plenty to say. By the time he died in 37 AD, Tiberius had become a myth wrapped in contradiction. A ruler who improved the economy, expanded the borders, and arguably prolonged the Pax Romana while simultaneously being accused of governing like a ghost. His funeral was modest, his memory anything but. And yet, Tiberius left behind more than a bad reputation. He left behind a blueprint for how power can be wielded not through presence, but through withdrawal. He ruled by not ruling, by making Rome wonder what he was doing, what he wanted, whether he was still watching. He made fear the default and secrecy the ultimate flex. Where Caligula lit the match, Tiberius built the room full of gas. And if that sounds like the darkest possible flavor of power, it only gets stranger from here. Because while Tiberius ruled through silence, the next ruler tried to command even death itself. Meet a king who fell in love so hard he refused to let go. A ruler who couldn't move on, even when the object of his desire had already crossed to the other side. Herod the Great. Herod the Great was not a man you casually crossed. He built cities, temples, fortresses, whole landscapes shaped by paranoia and grandeur. A client king of Judea under Roman rule, he spent most of his reign balancing on the knife edge between survival and spectacle. You could argue he was brilliant. You could argue he was monstrous. You'd be right either way. He ruled with the kind of intensity that made even Rome raise an eyebrow, constructing massive architectural projects one moment, ordering family executions the next. He was the kind of ruler who built entire ports and palaces just to prove he could. And yet, for all the political maneuvering, military precision, and brutal efficiency, Herod's most haunting legacy wasn't made of stone. It was made of obsession. Herod married 10 times, but only one woman truly consumed him, Mariamne I, his second wife. She was a Hasmonean princess, descended from the very royal family Herod had been appointed to replace. Marrying her gave him legitimacy, beauty, and eventually heartbreak that would twist itself into something far darker. By all accounts, Mariamne was stunning, educated, sharp, and aware of her own worth, and she didn't shy away from reminding Herod of it. She was not meek. She was not easily impressed. She resented the power he held over her family, and often told him so, sometimes publicly. It was a toxic bond from the start, passionate, fiery, charged with mutual mistrust. But Herod adored her, which, in his world, meant controlling her. The fear began early, whispers that she was plotting against him, that she resented him enough to act on it, that she might betray him to rivals. Some say these were rumors planted by Herod's own sister. Others say they grew in the fertile soil of Herod's own insecurities. Either way, the result was irreversible. Herod ordered Mariamne's execution, and then he unraveled. What followed was not grief in the usual sense. It was something more grotesque, more persistent, more resistant to closure. He began to wander the halls of his palaces, calling out her name. He issued commands to the servants, as if she were still alive. Some sources say he had her body preserved for a time, unable to let go. Whether embalmed, enshrined, or simply imagined, Mariamne refused to leave him. She had become a ghost he summoned at will. The people of Jerusalem began to talk. This wasn't mourning, it was obsession retrofitted as ritual. Herod, the master of empire building, could not rebuild the one thing he had destroyed with his own hand. His grip on reality began to loosen. He sought out seers. He dreamed of her nightly. His mental state, already brittle under the weight of power and paranoia, cracked under the pressure of loss, especially a loss he had authored. This is where history, rumor, and psychoanalysis get tangled. Ancient historians like Josephus wrote with a flair for the dramatic, and Roman sources often delighted in portraying Eastern rulers as unstable. So, the line between fact and embellishment is a shifting one. But what persists, what survives, all attempts at fact-checking, is the emotional core of the story. A king so consumed by desire that even death couldn't sever it. In some versions, Herod is described as keeping something of her behind, an object, a relic, a likeness, something to touch when the guilt became too loud. In other versions, it's Mariamne who haunts him, not literally, but emotionally. A constant reminder that his love was indistinguishable from his violence. And this is the paradox that defines Herod. He loved what he feared, and he destroyed what he loved. Not out of hatred, but because control was his only language. Mariamne's independence wasn't just a political threat, it was an existential one. Herod didn't understand love that wasn't submissive, so he did what he always did when threatened. He eliminated it, only to find that some things don't stay buried. Not really. In the end, Herod died slowly and painfully, his body reportedly failing in spectacular fashion. But long before his organs began to rot, his mind had already been hollowed out by grief masquerading as power. He left behind palaces, fortresses, aqueducts, and the story of a woman whose absence became more real to him than her presence ever was. It's tempting to view him as a tyrant with a soft spot. But that's the wrong lens. Herod's affection was never soft. It was sharp, suspicious, and ultimately fatal. His was not a romance. It was a possession that could not tolerate autonomy, a love story that ended in execution and lingered in madness. And if you thought that level of personal collapse was rare in the royal psyche, think again. Because the next monarch took things just as far but managed to survive the chaos of court and infamy with all his powdered wigs intact. A man who turned mistresses into policy, illegitimate children into legend, and beds into statecraft. Step forward into the perfumed, powdered world of King Charles II. King Charles II. By the time King Charles II returned to England in 1660, the monarchy had been abolished, his father had been publicly executed, and the country had endured more than a decade of Puritan rule, so severe that even dancing was considered a moral hazard. It's hard to overstate the tension in the air. England was draped in grey linen and quiet guilt, waiting for someone, anyone, to remind it that life could still be enjoyed. Charles obliged. Tall, charismatic, dark-eyed, and delightfully inappropriate, Charles II swept back into power with the swagger of a man who knew two things. One, that his very existence was a walking political gamble, and two, that pleasure, when weaponized correctly, could be a form of restoration. Thus began the Restoration period. And the restoration wasn't just of the monarchy. It was of music, of art, of laughter, of sexuality. But Charles didn't simply lift restrictions on entertainment. He made it a public virtue. The court under Charles II became a theatre of indulgence, and Charles was its central act. He surrounded himself with playwrights, poets, philosophers, and mistresses, all orbiting in a carefully orchestrated chaos that both dazzled and destabilized the political establishment. He didn't just tolerate vice, he institutionalized it. Charles had more than a dozen acknowledged mistresses. Some were aristocrats, some were actresses. One, Nell Gwynn, had sold oranges in the theatre before catching the king's eye. Another, Barbara Palmer, wielded enough political influence to rival a minister. And yet, the striking thing wasn't how many lovers he had, it was how openly he had them. Where most kings concealed their affairs behind drapes and euphemism, Charles brought them into the light. He gave them titles, estates, portraits. He fathered at least 12 illegitimate children, and rather than deny them, he elevated many of them into positions of power. The message was subtle but unmistakable. The king's pleasure was not a secret shame, it was policy. The Puritans, needless to say, were horrified. And yet the public, weary of repression, adored him. Charles was called the Merry Monarch, And it wasn't just because he liked parties. It was because he offered a kind of catharsis. After years of national austerity, here was a ruler who gave permission to live again, even if his own version of living included a rotating cast of courtiers, clandestine rendezvous, and a royal bed that rarely slept cold. But beneath the silk and satire, there was strategy. Charles understood something that many rulers before him hadn't, that charisma, when finely tuned, could be as powerful as legislation. He wielded charm like a weapon. He joked with parliamentarians. He exchanged gossip with philosophers. He flirted with foreign diplomats. It wasn't simply vanity, it was governance, disguised as frivolity. His sexual reputation was so prominent that it shaped foreign policy. The French, under Louis XIV, used mistresses as diplomatic tools. The Dutch printed pamphlets mocking his romantic escapades. Even the Vatican reportedly monitored his relationships, unsure whether they posed more of a moral threat or a political one. There's a story likely embellished that Charles once quipped, "I am the state's husband, and England is my mistress." Whether or not he said it, it fits. He treated the country like something to be seduced, with attention, affection, and the occasional abandonment. His personal life became national theatre, and he never once stepped out of character. But the image of the merry monarch came with a cost. While Charles made pleasure a political philosophy, he left behind a nation simmering with unresolved tensions. His policies wavered. His religious stance was slippery at best, nominally Protestant, but suspected of Catholic sympathies. He avoided conflict, often to a fault. And when he died in 1685, England found itself facing the same questions it had been asking for decades. Who rules, who governs, and what happens when charm runs out? Still, Charles never pretended to be what he wasn't. He once remarked on his deathbed with dry resignation, "I am sorry, gentlemen, for being such a long time a-dying." Even his final moments were a performance, irreverent, aware, and tinged with theatrical melancholy. And that's Charles II in a sentence, a king who ruled by entertaining his own downfall. He may not have left behind a legitimate heir, but he left behind a legacy that made future monarchs tremble at the idea of too much visibility. Because indulgence, once romanticized, quickly becomes routine, and from routine comes rot, which brings us rather suddenly to the modern era, to a prince who did not reign, but who found himself in headlines that read more like satire than scandal, a man who once made a statement so bizarre, so poetically awkward, that it became a meme, a metaphor, and a masterclass in royal discomfort. Next up, the tampon heard round the world, Prince Harry, modern anecdotal. Of all the monarchs, emperors, sultans, and divine right demigods in this increasingly unhinged royal parade, you might not expect to see Prince Harry, Duke of Sussex, standing in line. He was supposed to be the normal one, the cheeky younger brother, the military veteran, the good sport, the royal who, despite being born into velvet privilege, somehow managed to seem like he might actually enjoy going to the pub. And yet here we are, because even in the antiseptic, PR-sanitized halls of modern royalty, the bizarre still finds a microphone. This isn't a story about tyranny, decadence, or ghost-haunted castles. It's about something arguably worse, embarrassing vulnerability. The kind that doesn't end in scandal or execution but in memes, rewatches, and relentless group chats. The year is 1993. The medium is the telephone. The participants, Prince Charles and his then mistress, Camilla Parker Bowles. At some point during their intimate, very private exchange, Charles, perhaps out of boredom, affection, or some incomprehensible impulse, utters the immortal words, "I want to live inside your trousers. It would be much easier. What are you going to turn into? A pair of knickers? Or, God forbid, a Tampax? Just my luck." Yes, that happened. It was recorded, it was leaked, and it detonated like a ceremonial cannon in the heart of the British press. Now, you may be thinking, what does this have to do with Prince Harry? Everything. Because the children of royals inherit more than wealth and land. They inherit context, ghosts, public perception, and, in this case, the kind of unwanted legacy that no coronation can scrub clean, the awkward stain of family weirdness gone viral. Harry grew up under that shadow. The Tampongate transcript was everywhere by the time he was 9 years old. British tabloids ran it like it was state policy. Radio DJs read it on air in between pop songs. Satirists turned it into comedy gold. The monarchy, an institution predicated on reserve, dignity, and centuries of cold control, had been reduced to giggling over menstrual metaphors. No amount of military service or charity work was ever going to erase the fact that, for a long stretch of the 1992nd, the House of Windsor had become a punchline. Harry's adolescence played out inside that awkward cultural fog. The British press hounded him with the subtlety of a spotlight. Every teenage misstep, whether it was wearing a controversial costume or being photographed with a drink in hand, was interpreted not as normal behavior for a boy born into a human zoo, but as evidence of moral decay, poor upbringing, or genetic predisposition toward embarrassment. But there's a deeper layer here, one that's not about tabloid shame or dinner party gossip. It's about the psychological architecture of royalty in the modern world. Harry's life was shaped not only by the pressures of legacy, but by the impossibility of escape. You cannot opt out of a system that defines you before you speak your first word. You're not just born into wealth. You're born into a narrative, a story that will be written about you regardless of your actions. And in Harry's case, that story started with headlines that weren't even about him. They were about his parents, their dysfunction, their leaked phone calls, their uncomfortably human flaws. He was a supporting character in a melodrama he hadn't asked to audition for. So perhaps it's no wonder that decades later, he stepped away, moved continents, broke tradition, spoke out. The world interpreted this as rebellion. In reality, it was something much less glamorous: self-preservation. A quiet refusal to continue living as a public curiosity trapped in a family business that couldn't stop producing spectacle. And here's where the full irony sets in. For centuries, royal fetishes were whispered, hidden behind palace doors, revealed only by scandal or posthumous biography. But Harry's era is one where the grotesque isn't concealed, it's digitized, commodified, made instantly available to millions. And the strangest part? We expect it now. We anticipate the dysfunction. It's no longer shocking, it's scheduled. So when Prince Harry's family history began to echo through leaks and interviews and tell-all books, it wasn't surprising, it was inevitable. He didn't create the strangeness, he inherited it. And in trying to escape it, he became part of a newer, shinier, more global version of the same old machine. But make no mistake, there's something deeply uncanny about it all. A monarchy that once kept its secrets buried now finds its most intimate moments preserved not in history books, but in internet search bars. And if you thought this modern tale of metaphorical absorption was unsettling, wait until we return to the ancient world. Because the next emperor didn't just bend tradition. He reshaped it around a lover, a legacy, and a very public commitment to the one thing that history still pretends to whisper about: devotion between two men. Emperor I of Han. In the quiet, incense-scented halls of the Western Han dynasty, beneath the weight of silk curtains and centuries of Confucian etiquette, a scandal was unfolding, not with violence or bloodshed, but with a gesture so small and so intimate it would ripple through Chinese history for millennia. It involved a bed and a sleeve. Emperor I of Han ruled briefly, from 7 to 1 BCE, and his reign, though politically unremarkable, left behind a legacy that still stirs debate, discomfort, admiration, and confusion in equal measure. Not because of war, not because of reform, but because of love. His name was Dong Xian, a minor official when they met. Dong wasn't born into prestige or promised influence. He came from a modest family and likely expected a modest career. What he didn't expect was to become the emperor's favorite, an object of affection, promotion, and poetry, elevated from obscurity into the inner sanctum of imperial privilege. The story goes like this. One night, Dong fell asleep on the emperor's arm. Rather than wake him, Emperor Ai gently cut off his own sleeve and slipped away, leaving the boy to sleep undisturbed. It was a quiet moment, tender, practically invisible in the context of an empire, but the symbolism endured. That single gesture, a refusal to disturb the one he loved, became legend. In later dynastic records, the phrase, "the passion of the cut sleeve," would come to refer to male same-sex love, wrapped in royal memory and literary metaphor. But if you think this was a secret, whispered behind palace screens and cloaked in euphemism, think again. Emperor Ai wasn't subtle. He promoted Dong rapidly, granting him titles, land, command of military forces, and most shockingly, plans to make him successor. Dong, who had neither the birthright nor the credentials for such a position, suddenly stood within reach of the throne itself, and the court was perplexed. The Han bureaucracy was built on hierarchy, decorum, and tradition. Affection was fine in theory, but nepotism was not. Favor was expected, but it was supposed to be veiled, plausible, politically defensible. What Emperor Ai was doing looked less like discreet favoritism and more like a direct challenge to the very logic of Confucian governance. He wasn't just rewarding loyalty, he was reshaping the order of the state around his affection. And the whispers began. Not about scandal. Necessarily ancient Chinese culture, particularly during the Han, was far less rigid on same-sex relationships than later eras, but about stability, merit, legitimacy. Dong Xian had become more than a lover. He was now a symbol of disruption, the emperor's soft spot, his political blind spot. Still, the emperor held firm. He insisted on Dong's presence in court, in council, in bed. They were seen together, constantly riding, hunting, sharing meals. When Emperor Ai spoke of loyalty, it was clear who he meant. When he issued commands, it was often Dong who carried them out. And then, just as suddenly as it had risen, the reign ended. Emperor Ai died at the age of 26, young, politically embattled, and without a clear succession plan that anyone other than Dong recognized. Within days of his death, Dong was stripped of titles, command, and protection. The court turned on him with quiet efficiency. Some say Dong Xian took his own life. Others suggest he was forced. The records, as usual, are opaque. What is clear is that he vanished, erased from power and nearly from history, were it not for that one gesture, the cut sleeve. It's easy to frame this as a love story, and it is, in a way, a tale of devotion in an age of formality. But it's also a study in contradiction. Emperor Ai's relationship with Dong Xian wasn't scandalous because it was romantic. It was scandalous because it was visible, because it disrupted things, because it meant something. And the question lingers, was this love weaponized? Or was it simply allowed to exist, unhidden, in a world that preferred its affections shadowed and deniable? In modern times, the story is often told with reverence as a rare example of imperial same-sex love left relatively intact in the historical record. But within that reverence is unease. The discomfort of proximity, of public affection in the halls of absolute power, of a ruler who let his personal desires rewrite the flow of bureaucracy and paid for it. The Han dynasty moved on. The bureaucracy hardened. Confucianism tightened its grip. And soon, the soft gestures of emperors were replaced by harder codes, stricter traditions, and a sanitized version of history that tried, mostly unsuccessfully, to scrub away the memory of sleeves and beds and young men sleeping in the arms of kings. But before the Confucians could fully reclaim the narrative, another emperor would take the stage, one who knew exactly what it meant to love a man, to lose him, and to immortalize him not with a gesture, but with a statue. Because the next story isn't about a quiet romance, it's about a god carved from grief, Hadrian. If Emperor I of Han left behind a legend sewn quietly into the folds of a robe, then Hadrian, Emperor of Rome, built his heartbreak into marble, brick by brick, statue by statue, city by city. He was one of the 5 good emperors, though good in Roman history is always a relative term, usually meaning kept the Senate from openly revolting. Hadrian was an intellectual, a soldier, a lover of Greek philosophy and architecture. A man with a famously trimmed beard at a time when most Roman leaders preferred clean-shaven authority. He was meticulous, well-read, fond of travel, and often described as both brilliant and moody. But for all his military campaigns and public works, Hadrian's Wall being the most famous, his deepest and most enduring monument was not a wall at all. It was a boy. Antinous. The details of how they met are slippery. Antinous was a Greek youth from Bithynia, likely a teenager when he entered Hadrian's life. Whether he was brought to court as a page, an attendant, or something more intimate from the start is unknown. What is known is this: Hadrian fell in love, unmistakably, publicly. And not with the awkward, sidelong glances of a courtier trying to hide his scandal, but with the openness of a man who didn't think it was a scandal. Hadrian and Antinous travelled together extensively. Paintings and sculpture show them side by side riding, hunting, gazing out toward the Aegean. Hadrian's letters and poems brim with emotion not usually found in the tightly composed image of a Roman emperor. Now, love in ancient Rome was a complicated concept. Power, status, and dominance played roles we wouldn't recognize today. Relationships between older men and younger boys were not uncommon, but they were also expected to fade quietly into memory. What Hadrian did was different. He didn't let it fade. He canonized it. In 130 CE, during a tour of Egypt, tragedy struck. Antinous drowned in the Nile under circumstances that remain mysterious. Officially, it was an accident. Unofficially, speculation has never stopped. Some claimed he took his own life as part of a ritual. Others said it was murder. Still others whispered that he was sacrificed. Hadrian never gave a clear explanation, and that silence only deepened the myth. What came next was unprecedented. Hadrian, consumed by grief, didn't just mourn. He deified Antinous. He founded a city in his name, Antinopolis, on the banks of the Nile where the boy had died. He commissioned dozens of statues, each idealized, each slightly different, spreading the image of Antinous throughout the empire. Sculptors across Rome were suddenly very busy turning a provincial youth into a god. Shrines were built, coins were minted, cults were established. Hadrian, a man tasked with ruling the known world, diverted the machinery of empire into a personal memorial. And not quietly, not metaphorically. The cult of Antinous became one of the last great state-sponsored religions of pagan Rome. In temples across the Mediterranean, citizens left offerings not to Jupiter or Mars, but to a boy from Bithynia who had once shared a tent with the emperor. Historians have debated for centuries what this meant. Was it love? Was it obsession? Was it grief, weaponized into divine architecture? Maybe it was all of those things. Hadrian didn't write a eulogy. He built one. In stone, in ritual, in spectacle. It was a form of immortality that emperors typically reserved for themselves. Yet here he was, crafting it for someone else, for someone far beneath him in rank, but towering over him in memory. The Senate, predictably, was uncomfortable. Roman values were flexible, but not that flexible. Deifying emperors after death? Acceptable. Deifying a young companion while still alive? Risky. Scandalous. Politically dangerous. But Hadrian didn't back down. He doubled down. Antinous became as permanent in Rome's iconography as any god or hero. And the world, strangely, didn't collapse. Antinous outlived Hadrian in marble. His statues survived the fall of Rome. His cult faded with the Christianization of the empire, but his image persisted. Even today you can walk into museums in Berlin, Paris, London, and see the same face repeated, smooth, melancholy, idealized. A face not of power, but of memory. Frozen in the act of being remembered. And Hadrian? He died not long after, his health failing, his grief never dulled. His own mausoleum, what we now call Castel Sant'Angelo in Rome, still stands, as imposing and impenetrable as the man who built it. But it is Antinous who lingers more vividly. The boy who became a god, because an emperor couldn't let him go. So when people say that royal love affairs are fleeting, decorative, or strictly political, they forget Hadrian. He turned longing into legacy, grief into godhood. And if you thought that was the furthest Rome could stretch the boundaries of power and passion, wait until you meet the next emperor who didn't just rewrite the script on imperial relationships, he broke the fourth wall entirely. Because coming up next is a ruler who didn't just blur the lines between gender and authority, he dissolved them in gold. Elagabalus. In the vast pantheon of Roman emperors, many mad, most extravagant, some memorable, Elagabalus occupies a category all his own. He didn't just break the rules. He set them on fire, danced in the ashes, and threw a lavish banquet in their honor, all before the age of 18. He ruled Rome for just 4 years, from 218 to 222 CE, but left behind enough scandal, confusion, and political whiplash to last centuries. His reign wasn't just controversial, it was baffling. It wasn't just decadent, it was theatrical. And at the heart of that theatre was one of the most mysterious royal identities in world history. Born Sextus Varius Avitus Bassianus, Elagabalus wasn't raised in the heart of Rome, but in Emesa, modern-day Homs, Syria, where he served as high priest to the local sun god Elagabal, a deity so obscure to Roman sensibilities that the boy priest would eventually rename himself after the god, fusing religion and monarchy into a single, confusingly luminous package. He came to power through a military coup staged by his grandmother. That sentence alone should set the tone. Once installed on the imperial throne, Elagabalus wasted no time trying to realign the Roman world, religiously, culturally, sexually. He brought his Eastern deity to Rome, building an enormous black stone temple in its honor. He attempted to place Elagabal at the top of the Roman pantheon, even above Jupiter, which did not go over particularly well with the Senate, or the priests, or the people, or, honestly, anyone. But theology was just the appetizer. Elagabalus's personal life was where his real campaign against tradition took place. And unlike many emperors who cloak their indulgences in shadow, he made his identity fluid, excessive, public, a spectacle of state. He married multiple times, at least 5 by some accounts, including to a Vestal Virgin, which was the Roman equivalent of spray painting graffiti on a temple. These women came and went, rarely lasting long in the imperial spotlight, but the most enduring and perhaps sincere relationship of Elagabalus's life was with a man, a charioteer named Heracles. Heracles wasn't noble, he wasn't Roman, he certainly wasn't someone the Senate wanted to see seated next to the emperor, but Elagabalus adored him, promoted him, called him his husband, and referred to himself openly and repeatedly as Heracles' wife. Not his consort, not his partner, his wife. This wasn't just provocative, it was radical. In a society where gender roles were scripted tighter than a Roman tragedy, Elagabalus walked right off the stage and into something else entirely. He wore makeup. He adorned himself in women's clothing. He preferred being addressed with feminine titles. According to ancient sources, some hostile, some merely confused. He even asked physicians if it were possible to alter his body to match his identity. It wasn't, not yet. And here lies the challenge. How do you talk about someone like Elagabalus using the vocabulary of an empire that didn't have the words? Modern scholars still debate whether Elagabalus was transgender, gender non-conforming, or simply a young monarch reveling in the thrill of provocation. But, to the Roman elite, there was no academic framing. There was only horror. They didn't understand what he was trying to be, only that it wasn't what an emperor was supposed to be. Elagabalus turned the imperial palace into a space of performance art, blending divine ritual, gender fluidity, and political chaos. His dinners were legendary not for the food, but for the drama. Guests might be served peas laced with gemstones, or find themselves crushed under a surprise avalanche of flower petals. One minute he was sacrificing bulls in robes sewn with gold. The next, he was parading through the streets in makeup, trailing perfume, inviting reactions like offerings. To the conservative senatorial class, this wasn't leadership, it was heresy, lunacy, a symptom of a Rome losing its grip on order. And yet, what made Elagabalus dangerous wasn't his eccentricity, it was his refusal to apologize for it. He didn't hide behind palace walls, he didn't whisper his preferences, he made the entire empire watch. That refusal came at a cost. At the age of 18, after just 4 years in power, Elagabalus was assassinated by his own guards, his body unceremoniously disposed of, his memory condemned, his statues destroyed. Rome tried to erase him. It didn't work. Because while the Senate could burn records and silence inscriptions, they couldn't quite erase the echo of the question Elagabalus posed to the empire. What if the emperor decides who he is, not the empire? It's a question that still makes people uncomfortable. Because beneath the spectacle, beneath the wild dinners and defiant rituals, Elagabalus was more than a boy emperor in glitter and defiance. He was a mirror, and Rome, ancient, powerful, and terrified, didn't like what it saw. And just when you think you've reached the limit of royal audacity, history offers up a poet-warrior from the East, a conqueror whose heart, like his empire, never stayed within the expected boundaries. Next is a man remembered not only for founding a dynasty, but for the romantic verses he penned to another man's eyes. Babur, Before the Mughal Empire became synonymous with domes of marble and palaces of jeweled fountains, it began with a boy who wrote poetry. His name was Zahir-ud-Din Muhammad Babur, and by most historical standards, he shouldn't have mattered. He was a displaced Timurid prince, descendant of both Timur and Genghis Khan, with a shaky claim to almost everything. The 15th century world he was born into was not interested in sentiment. It was brutal, unstable, and soaked in the politics of inheritance and conquest. But Babur wrote about feelings, and not just in the way conquerors usually do, which is to say vaguely, and only when the blood has dried. He wrote about longing, about gardens and spring rains, about loneliness and joy, and, most strikingly, about love between men. Now, in the context of Central Asian court life, poetry wasn't some fringe hobby. It was a badge of intellect, masculinity, even leadership. Babur's contemporaries expected the rulers to be literate, even lyrical, but Babur took it further. His writing wasn't just political, it was personal. He recorded, in detail, the ache of desire. And in a moment of startling candor, tucked between lines about military strategy and family honor, he tells the story of his infatuation with a boy named Baburi. Yes, their names were almost the same. No, that doesn't help the historians. Baburi was likely a young man in Babur's service, a soldier, an attendant, possibly a court companion. He was not royal, he was not powerful. But he had, according to Babur, the kind of eyes that wreck you for days. Here's how Babur describes it. I had never seen anyone so beautiful. His beauty intoxicated me. I became forgetful and distracted. Forgetful, distracted. Those aren't the words of a sultan posturing for history. Those are the words of someone spiraling quietly into the kind of desire that ruins your plans and shortens your sentences. And he didn't stop at a passing compliment. He returned to it, obsessively. He writes of stealing glances in the courtyard, of longing so intense it made him physically ill, of the shame and thrill of unspoken affection. Now, to be clear, Babur didn't have the luxury of living in a world that validated this kind of attraction. He was a Muslim monarch in a deeply patriarchal society, surrounded by advisors, generals, clerics, and rivals who would not have tolerated open deviation from the expected norms of masculinity. And yet, he recorded it. He put it into his memoir, the Baburnama, not as scandal, not as confession, but as truth, as part of his story, as something that belonged to him. That act alone is astonishing, because royal memoirs were not therapy sessions. They were curated performances, written to justify, explain, and glorify. Babur's decision to include not just military campaigns and bloodlines, but the tender ache of a private infatuation reveals something rare. A ruler who wanted to be remembered not just as a conqueror, but as a human being. The Baburnama, written in Chagatai Turkic and later translated into Persian, gives us a window into his inner world. And in that world, Baburi flickers like a candle. Brief, burning, unforgettable. What happened to him? No one knows. He vanishes from the record, as minor figures in royal histories often do. Perhaps he died young. Perhaps he left the court. Perhaps he remained unnoticed by everyone except the man who once wrote poems in his name. But even after Baburi's physical presence fades, the memory lingers in Babur's writing, and not just in romantic verse, in metaphor, in mourning. In the subtle shift of tone that occurs when someone talks about a loss they never quite figured out how to carry. Meanwhile, Babur went on to do what conquerors are supposed to do. He invaded northern India, won decisive battles, established the Mughal Empire, became the ancestor of emperors who would one day build the Taj Mahal. And yet, For all that empire building, it's his writing that endures. The part of him that wasn't carved into stone, but pressed gently into paper. In the centuries that followed, Babur's sexual orientation became a quiet footnote in historical discussions, either downplayed, ignored, or reframed as poetic license. Some historians have defended it, others questioned it, but the text remains. And in that text, a man known for forging an empire lets himself be seen for just a moment as someone longing, waiting, watching. Which brings us to a peculiar pattern that in so many royal courts, from Rome to India, from Egypt to France, it's not the wars that survive, it's the longing, the confessions tucked between decrees, the feelings hidden in plain view. And if Babur's moment of tender candor feels unusual for a sultan, wait until you meet a ruler who did not hide his preferences behind poetry. Because next comes a man who entrusted his empire not to generals or heirs, but to a eunuch slave whose presence in the palace reshaped the very definition of loyalty and love. Alauddin Khalji. In the long, blood-soaked annals of the Delhi Sultanate, Alauddin Khalji stands out not just as a ruthless military commander or an ambitious centralizer of power, but as a man who trusted no one except a eunuch named Malik Kafur. The year was 1296. Northern India was fractured into rival kingdoms, and the Khalji dynasty had just clawed its way to power. Alauddin, a nephew by marriage to the previous sultan, had seized the throne in a violent coup. His rise was bloody, calculated, and fast. But what followed wasn't just military conquest. It was a transformation of the court itself into a realm ruled by obsession, paranoia, and something that looked very much like love. Malik Kafur enters the story in 1299, captured during Alauddin's campaign in Gujarat. He was not a soldier, not a noble, not even a volunteer. He was a slave, castrated before his teenage years, likely as part of the long and horrific trade in court eunuchs that extended from Central Asia into the Indian subcontinent. And yet, within just a few years of his arrival at court, Malik Kafur was no longer a captive. He was a commander, a trusted advisor, a man with unrestricted access to the Sultan's inner circle and, by all available accounts, to his private chambers. The transformation was dizzying. Court chroniclers began to whisper that Alauddin saw no one without Kafur, that the Sultan deferred to him in private, praised him in public, and allowed him to speak on matters of state with a familiarity that outraged the nobles. Kafur was promoted to the highest ranks of military command, leading expeditions deep into the south, raiding the dynasties of the Deccan Plateau, toppling temples, gathering spoils, and returning to Delhi with unimaginable wealth. But this wasn't just about political convenience or battlefield skill. This was personal. Accounts from the period, most notably from the historian Ziauddin Barani, suggest that Alauddin's relationship with Malik Kafur was not merely one of master and servant, or even ruler and protege, but something deeper and more volatile. Barani, writing a generation later, was careful with his language still bound by the limits of medieval Islamic propriety, but the subtext is clear. He saw the bond between Alauddin and Kafur as morally troubling, politically dangerous, and emotionally excessive. Alauddin didn't just favor Kafur, he trusted him completely. In a court filled with poisoners, rebels, and double-crossing aristocrats, Kafur was the only figure who seemed immune to suspicion. And suspicion, in Alauddin's Delhi, was a default setting. The Sultan ruled like a man permanently surrounded by traitors. He banned alcohol, outlawed private meetings, created a surveillance network to track nobles and their conversations. His reforms were draconian yet effective. Prices stabilized, military ranks were standardized, revolts were crushed before they could form. The empire, however briefly, functioned with mechanical efficiency. But the one area where Alauddin showed no restraint was Kafur. He gifted him property, titles, honors that should have gone to seasoned nobles. Kafur lived in luxury gilded robes, a private palace wing, servants of his own. His enemies, who were, by then, legion, accused him of manipulating the Sultan, of exploiting his charming demeanor, of whispering into the ear of a man too lonely, too paranoid, and too enthralled to resist. And then came the final twist. In the last years of Alauddin's life, when the Sultan grew sick, disoriented, and weak, it was Malik Kafur who assumed practical control of the empire. Not officially, not in public, but behind the screens of the palace, it was Kafur who met with emissaries. Kafur who signed commands. Kafur who decided who could see the ailing Sultan and who could not. When Alauddin finally died in 1316, the royal court didn't pause for mourning. It erupted into chaos. Kafur declared that the young heir Alauddin's son was unfit to rule. He installed a puppet child ruler instead and declared himself regent. The nobles, already seething with resentment, moved swiftly. Within weeks, Kafur was dragged from the palace and killed. Not quietly, not with honor, but with the fury reserved for someone who had, in their eyes, violated the deepest codes of hierarchy and dignity. His body was discarded, his name almost scrubbed from court chronicles. But history has a way of keeping receipts. Even centuries later, the story of Alauddin and Malik Kafur survives not just as an anecdote of favoritism, but as a study in royal fixation. A sultan, surrounded by enemies, built an empire on fear but reserved his trust for a single, unlikely figure. A slave, a eunuch, a man whose love, loyalty, or manipulation, depending on whom you ask, rewrote the laws of courtly power. So, what was it? Was Kafur a brilliant opportunist? A loyal companion? A seducer with strategic timing? Or was he, perhaps, the one person who gave Alauddin something he never found elsewhere? Emotional safety in a world built entirely on conquest. We'll never know. But we do know this. He wasn't the only ruler who elevated a male companion far beyond custom. Next, we cross into the world of Persian steel and poetic sensitivity, where the conqueror of Central Asia met his match not on the battlefield, but in the form of a beautiful slave who turned devotion into dynasty. Mahmud of Ghazni. In the cold, calculated world of medieval conquest, Mahmud of Ghazni was a man who left no ambiguity about his ambitions. He was a military tactician, a state builder, a patron of scholars and poets, and, most famously, the first Muslim ruler to be given the title Sultan. The word itself meant power, and Mahmud wielded it like a blade. From his base in Ghazni, now in modern-day Afghanistan, he launched no fewer than 17 expeditions into the Indian subcontinent, plundering temples, collecting tribute, and expanding his influence with the strategic zeal of a man who didn't believe in half measures. His campaigns brought unimaginable wealth back to his court, and along with the gold and spoils, he brought something else: Malik Ayaz. Now, depending on which version of history you prefer, Persian court records, Turkish military chronicles, or romantic poetry, Malik Ayaz was either a gifted Turkic military commander or the object of Mahmud's deepest and most enduring affection. Or both. He was originally a slave, captured in one of Mahmud's campaigns. In those days, a slave wasn't necessarily a servant in the modern sense. Slaves could be trained as soldiers, advisors, or bureaucrats. Some became generals, some became kings, and Ayaz would become all of the above, an exceptional figure who rose from captivity to near equality with the Sultan himself. But this is not just a rags to riches story. It's a story of obsession, restraint, and a kind of paradoxical intimacy that still puzzles historians. Let's start with the basics. Mahmud elevated Ayaz quickly. He gave him titles, lands, and the governorship of Lahore, one of the most prized cities in the empire. This was not a ceremonial role. Ayaz governed with autonomy, competence, and remarkable loyalty. Even Mahmud's most bitter critics couldn't deny Ayaz's skill. But the political appointments were only one side of the coin. The other side was quieter. There are accounts of the Sultan visiting Ayaz's quarters daily, of the two spending long hours in private conversation, of Mahmud lavishing gifts on him far beyond what was customary, and most tellingly of Mahmud commissioning poets to write verses about Ayaz's beauty and virtue. This wasn't whispered scandal. It was public art. The Persian poet Ferdowsi, who completed the legendary Shahnameh under Mahmud's patronage, described Ayaz in symbolic terms, likening him to the sun, to wine, to divine light. Other poets followed suit, painting the bond between sultan and slave not as one of political necessity, but of spiritual devotion. And yet, Mahmud was careful. Very careful. In all the official chronicles, there is a clear insistence. The Sultan never crossed a line. He is praised repeatedly for his restraint, for his refusal to succumb to desire. For loving Ayaz, yes, but from a distance, admiring him, adoring him, possibly even suffering for him, but never defiling him. Of course, this raises a far more interesting question. Why was everyone so obsessed with emphasizing his restraint? It suggests that the feelings were obvious, that the bond was undeniable, but that the only way to preserve Mahmud's image as a model of piety was to turn his desire into a moral test, one that he supposedly passed. But here's the thing about courtly chroniclers. They don't record restraint unless something powerful is threatening to break it. And the language used to describe Ayaz is not the language of casual friendship. It's devotional, intimate, overwhelming. There's even a famous story in which Mahmud orders Ayaz's hair to be shaved so he can better control his own attraction. A small theatrical act made enormous by the fact that it was recorded at all. In public, Mahmud ruled an empire of swords and sermons, but in private, he seems to have orbiting him a kind of gravitational pull, a man who never challenged him politically, but who haunted him emotionally. Ayaz outlived Mahmud. After the Sultan's death in 1030, Ayaz remained a governor, continued his administrative work, and slowly receded into history. His tomb still stands in Lahore, modest but intact, and still visited today. But the real monument to Ayaz isn't a tomb. It's the poetry, the verses, the endless metaphors that cast him as the moon to Mahmud's dark sky. The lover who made the conqueror ache not with conquest, but with longing. And this is what makes their story so oddly eternal. Because the love or adoration or obsession between Mahmud and Ayaz was never sealed with a kiss or a scandal. It was preserved through art, through restraint, through absence, the kind of love that speaks more through silence than touch. Was it romantic, platonic, political? Maybe the answer is all three, or none. Or maybe the answer was never meant for us. But the pattern is becoming hard to ignore. Time and again, we see royal power pulled off its axis by some quiet gravitational force, a lover, a companion, a whisper in the dark that alters the path of history. And if you think emperors of China were any different, stoic, Confucian, emotionally contained, think again. Because the next story belongs to a ruler whose reign was marked not by scandal, but by the persistent presence of one man whose shadow never seemed to leave the emperor's side, Gongmin of Goryeo. The history of Korea's Goryeo dynasty is often taught with an emphasis on military unrest, Mongol interference, and the eventual birth of the Joseon state. But nestled deep within that chronicle between diplomatic dispatches and Confucian reforms is the reign of King Gongmin, a monarch who defied expectation, tradition, and emotional convention. Ruling from 1351 to 1374, Gongmin lived during one of the most volatile periods in Korean history. His throne was not stable, his court was not loyal, and his country was recovering from decades of domination by the Mongol Yuan dynasty, which had treated Goryeo kings as little more than vassals. So when Gongmin ascended the throne, the expectations were simple: preserve order, restore dignity, and follow the rules. He did the opposite. At first, Gongmin played the part of a dutiful monarch. He dutifully married Princess Noguk, a Mongol princess selected for him by the Yuan court, solidifying his foreign alliance. He maintained appearances. He said the right things. But inside the palace, he was already slipping away from tradition and toward a man named Hong Ryun. Now, in court records, Hong Ryun is first introduced not as a general, not as a nobleman, but as one of the king's kajewi, a member of the royal bodyguard corps. His job was, on paper, to protect the king. But he quickly became far more than that. He became a companion, a confidant, a shadow in the king's presence. And then he became the center of his world. It's important to understand the emotional architecture of King Gongmin's life. This was not a man raised in indulgence. He had spent years essentially as a hostage in the Yuan court. He had little personal agency. His marriage to Princess Noguk was political. His advisors were spies for foreign interests. The throne was not a seat of comfort, it was a place of exile. But in Hong Ryun, Gongmin seemed to find something else. Not just companionship, but control, emotional reliability, loyalty untainted by politics. The relationship became the talk of the court, not in open mockery no one dared, but in the anxious, veiled murmurs of ministers who sensed that the king was no longer listening to them. Hong Ryun moved quickly through the ranks. He was granted access to private councils. He appeared at diplomatic events. He received estates, titles, and attention so disproportionate that the court could no longer deny what was happening. And then came the scandal. After the death of Princess Noguk in 1365, an event that devastated the king emotionally and politically, Gongmin's behavior became even more erratic. Grief-stricken and unmoored, he turned inward, dismissing high officials, abolishing traditional marriage alliances, and reportedly filling the court with handsome young men under the guidance of Hong Ryun himself. The historical sources, many of which were written later under more conservative regimes, describe this period with carefully coded language. They speak of moral decline, of inappropriate behavior, of rituals being neglected, and court roles being distorted. But under all this euphemism is a fairly clear picture. Gongmin had abandoned traditional royal protocol in favor of a private, emotionally charged court orbiting around Hong Ryun. And that court was dangerous. Because Gongmin didn't just trust Hong Ryun, he listened to him. And when your king listens only to one person, and that person answers to no one, the political system begins to crack. Rumors circulated that Hong Ryun was eliminating rivals, that Gongmin had grown paranoid, unstable, and detached from governing, that the royal court had become a theatre of favoritism and secrecy, and eventually, someone decided it had to end. In 1374, King Gongmin was assassinated, stabbed in his sleep by one of his own guards, reportedly as part of a plot orchestrated by a faction of court officials and generals who saw the king's emotional mismanagement as a threat to the dynasty's survival. Hadrian was executed soon after. Their names were scrubbed from court memorials, and the official histories, compiled later under the Neo-Confucian Joseon dynasty, treated the entire episode as a cautionary tale, a ruler overcome by passion, a state undone by personal indulgence. The lesson was clear: emotion has no place on the throne. But the story is more complicated than that. Because Gongmin wasn't just a man undone by affection, he was a ruler trying to reclaim autonomy in a palace that had never allowed him to be human. And in that struggle, he clung to the one relationship he could control. Whether it was love, obsession, or dependence hardly matters. What matters is that, for a brief moment in Goryeo's twilight, a king tried to govern not with tradition, but with feeling. And it cost him everything. Still, the memory of Gongmin and Hadrian lingers not as scandal, but as evidence that even in the most rigid hierarchical courts, love, or something dangerously like it, can override duty. And if you think that was an isolated cultural anomaly, just wait. Because next comes a king from East Africa who turned same-sex relationships into palace policy, surrounded himself with young male attendants, and dared his missionaries and his colonizers to challenge him. Mwanga II of Buganda. In the late 19th century, while European powers were busy carving up Africa under the thin pretense of civilizing it, there stood a king in East Africa who refused to be categorized either by the missionaries who came with crosses or the colonial administrators who came with contracts. His name was Mwanga II, the Kabaka of Buganda, a powerful pre-colonial kingdom located in present-day Uganda. And his reign, marked by upheaval, defiance, and dramatic contradictions, remains one of the most debated and misunderstood episodes in African royal history. Mwanga ascended the throne in 1884 at just 18 years old, inheriting a kingdom already wobbling from the pressures of foreign influence. Arab traders, British missionaries, and German agents were flooding into East Africa, each one eager to partner, protect, or convert. For a young ruler trying to assert sovereignty, these weren't invitations, they were slow-moving invasions. And Mwanga, for all his youth, saw that clearly. But what made his story so tangled, so endlessly dissected by historians, wasn't just his politics, it was his relationships. Specifically, his court of male pages, young attendants who lived within the royal enclosure and served the Kabaka directly. These pages, drawn from noble families, were more than servants. They were symbols of proximity to power, and sometimes much more than that. The European missionaries who visited Mwanga's court were scandalized, not just by the politics, not by the rituals, but by the dynamics between the king and his pages. They accused him of moral deviance, of forcing his attendants into relationships that blurred every line between tradition and impropriety. In the missionaries' eyes, Mwanga wasn't just a political threat, he was a walking affront to Victorian morality. And in their reports, they made little distinction between cultural misunderstanding and moral condemnation. They used the language of sin to describe what was, in fact, a deeply embedded part of palace life. In traditional Bugandan culture, the Kabaka's authority was absolute. He was expected to be both feared and revered. Royal intimacy, physical or emotional, was not necessarily seen through the Western lens of scandal. It was a demonstration of dominance, A kind of ritualized privilege. What Europeans interpreted as vice, local elites might have viewed as the normal, if uncomfortable, price of access to the throne. Still, Mwanga was no fool. He knew exactly how the missionaries saw him, and he resented it. Their moral posturing wasn't just religious, it was political. By challenging his authority over the royal pages, they were effectively challenging his sovereignty. Things came to a head in 1886, when a group of young Christian converts among the royal pages began refusing the king's summons. Encouraged by foreign missionaries, they claimed their new faith forbade them from obeying the Kabaka in all matters, including private ones. Mwanga saw it as open rebellion. He ordered the execution of dozens of Christian converts, including some of his former pages. They were burned, speared, mutilated, gruesome deaths meant to send a message: "This is my court, my kingdom, and you do not tell a king whom he may command." The killings shocked the British. The story of the Ugandan martyrs quickly became a rallying cry for intervention, conveniently ignoring the fact that the British had already been eyeing Buganda as a colonial target. Within a few years, Mwanga found himself first a puppet, then a prisoner, then a pawn. He was eventually exiled to the Seychelles, where he died in obscurity in 1903. History tried to reduce Mwanga to one of two things: a tyrant or a victim. But the truth is far more layered. He was a traditionalist caught in the crossfire of cultural imperialism, a monarch who clung to his authority by any means necessary, even when those means put him at odds with the rising tide of Christian ethics, colonial diplomacy, and modernist sensibilities. His personal relationships, whatever they truly were, became the battlefield on which broader wars of ideology and empire were fought. And in the aftermath, the narrative was rewritten by the victors. The missionaries got their martyrs, the colonizers got their protectorate, and Mwanga became a footnote, more scandal than story. But the tension he embodied still echoes, between power and intimacy, between cultural autonomy and moral judgment, between tradition and the foreign gaze. And that same tension appears again, this time not in Africa, but in India, where another Muslim sultan would rise, rule, and risk everything for the affections of a companion the world could neither understand nor accept: Khsrau Khan. In the chaotic corridors of Delhi's royal history, one name stands out, not for the empire he built, but for the love that brought it crashing down. Khsrau Khan, briefly the Sultan of Delhi in 1320, wasn't born into nobility. He wasn't even born Muslim. He was a Hindu convert, a former slave, a court favourite who, through charm, ambition, and proximity to power, climbed to the very top of one of medieval India's most formidable political structures. And, as was often the case with men who rose quickly in the Delhi Sultanate, he fell just as fast. But his story is far more than a palace coup. It's the tale of a man whose rise was intimately bound to a same-sex relationship that disrupted an entire dynasty. Khsrau Khan entered the service of Mubarak Shah, the last ruler of the Khalji dynasty, during a time of relative instability. The court was fractured, factions jostled for influence. Into this world stepped Khsrau, a striking, charismatic young man of Baradu Rajput descent, captured and converted during earlier campaigns. Mubarak Shah noticed him immediately. According to later chroniclers, the Sultan became deeply infatuated with his new attendant. But unlike more subtle rulers who veiled their preferences behind protocol, Mubarak was unapologetically demonstrative. He gave Khsrau titles, lands, an army sometimes over the objections of his most senior advisors. More importantly, he gave him access to strategy, to the treasury, to the symbolic core of the court. Mubarak didn't merely favour Khsrau, he trusted him as a second self. The two were inseparable, even as the whispers grew louder. The courtiers called it unnatural. The historians, decades later, called it treasonous. But in the moment, it was something far more potent: intimate governance. The line between affection and authority was blurred beyond recognition. Then came the betrayal. In 1320, Khsrau Khan, now the head of a powerful faction within the court, orchestrated a conspiracy. He assassinated Mubarak Shah, seized the throne, and declared himself Sultan of Delhi. The shock was total. A lover had killed his patron, a convert had overthrown a dynasty, a court favourite had rewritten the rules of succession in one clean stroke. But the reign was brief. The political backlash was immediate and brutal. Khsrau's legitimacy was questioned from all sides. Rival nobles who had once watched his rise with quiet envy now moved decisively. Within weeks, Khsrau Khan was deposed and executed by Ghiyasuddin Tughlaq, who would go on to found the next dynasty. Khajeh's body was discarded. His reign was marked as an aberration, and the chroniclers made sure to frame his rise and fall as a cautionary tale, a warning about the dangers of desire in the halls of power. But buried beneath that moral panic is a more interesting question. What if Khsrau Khan wasn't just a manipulator or opportunist, but also, genuinely, the Sultan's chosen partner in power? What if the court couldn't handle the idea that loyalty could come from intimacy, not just bloodlines? And what does it say that the court's greatest fear wasn't the betrayal, but the reason behind the betrayal? Because the next emperor didn't betray anyone. He ruled quietly, dutifully, and still found himself drawn to men who would outlast the empire in poetry, paintings, and half-whispered speculation. Next, we head back to China, where yet another Han emperor found his most trusted allies, not in his generals or ministers, but in the warmth of his male companions. Emperor Cheng of Han. In the opulent heart of the Western Han dynasty, where etiquette dictated emotion, and emperors were expected to reproduce like clockwork, Emperor Cheng stands as a perplexing figure. He ruled from 33 to 7 BCE, inheriting a throne from a long line of dynastic architects. But instead of expanding borders or executing grand reforms, he became infamous for something far more confusing to the state. He didn't produce an heir. For a Chinese emperor, failing to generate offspring wasn't just a personal matter. It was a national crisis. Confucian ideals demanded continuity. The empire depended on succession. And Emperor Cheng, despite having empresses, consorts, and endless palace resources, seemed strangely unmotivated to fulfill this basic imperial duty. Whispers began to circulate. Was it a health issue? A secret vow of abstinence? Or something far less explainable by the physicians and far more troubling to the bureaucrats? Was the emperor simply not interested in women? Historical texts, particularly the Book of Han, hint at an answer. Emperor Cheng's deepest attachments, they suggest, were not to his wives, but to a series of beautiful young men in his personal retinue. Among them, one name repeats with quiet regularity: Zhang Fang. Zhang Fang began as a minor palace attendant, but quickly gained extraordinary favor. The emperor's attentions toward him were both affectionate and publicly noted. He accompanied Cheng on outings, received expensive gifts, and was often granted more personal time with the emperor than even the highest-ranked consorts. This pattern wasn't unique to one individual. Emperor Cheng was known for surrounding himself with male companions, attendants, musicians, entertainers, all drawn into his orbit by beauty, wit, or some ineffable magnetism that appealed to the emperor's elusive heart. To the Confucian scholars and ministers, this was not just embarrassing, it was threatening. How could the empire plan for its future if the emperor seemed preoccupied with present pleasure and pleasure that did not produce heirs? In one particularly telling episode, Empress Xu, the emperor's first wife, was accused of witchcraft after failing to bear a child. Her rivals, the famous Zhao sisters, seized the opportunity to remove her from power, only to later fall from favor themselves. In the background of these political purges, the emperor's male favorites remained untouched, quiet, observing. That silence speaks volumes. Despite the storm of court intrigue around the women in his life, Cheng's relationship with his male companions was curiously undisturbed. It wasn't celebrated, but it wasn't suppressed either. It simply existed, a quiet fact beneath the loud failures of imperial succession. And yet, for all his passivity, Cheng wasn't powerless. He maintained strict control over who had access to his inner court. He preserved the lives and privileges of those he truly cared for. And in his own way, he resisted the machinery of reproduction that the court tried so hard to force on him. When he died suddenly, at the age of 45, he left no direct heir, no son, no legacy of dynastic continuation. His successor, chosen by political necessity rather than blood, marked a turning point in the Han court's desperation to secure the line. And still, Zhang Fang's name survives, not in grand records, but in the margins. In the gentle phrasing of historians who knew better than to say too much but still said enough. Because Cheng's reign wasn't just a pause in the empire's growth, it was a reflection of how imperial desire, when it failed to align with expectation, could quietly defy the entire system. And that defiance would echo again in the marble halls of Prussia, where a future king would find himself emotionally entangled with another man. Only this time, their intimacy unfolded under the weight of militarism, surveillance, and a father who watched everything, Prince Frederick the Great. Before he became Frederick the Great, the military genius of Prussia, he was simply Fritz, a sensitive, intellectual young man whose tastes leaned less toward marching drills and more toward philosophy, music, and, inconveniently, other men. Born in 1712 to Frederick William I, the soldier king of Prussia, young Frederick was expected to become a model of Prussian masculinity. Cold, efficient, militarily obsessed, and deeply Protestant. Instead, he played the flute, read French poetry, collected books. He spoke openly of admiration for Enlightenment thinkers. He wore silks when no one was looking. But it was his friendship, though many argue romantic entanglement with a young officer named Hans Hermann von Katte, that triggered one of the most disturbing episodes in Prussian royal history. Katte was handsome, cultured, and close to the crown prince. Too close, in the eyes of Frederick's father. Their relationship had become intimate, coded in long letters and private walks, shared books and secret plans. Because yes, there were plans. Frederick, chafing under the control of his tyrannical father, plotted to flee Prussia altogether. He wanted to escape to England, to live freely, to leave behind the crushing weight of royal expectation. And Katte was in on it. The escape attempt failed. Frederick William, already furious at his son's softness, saw the attempt as treason, and when he discovered the extent of Katte's involvement, he didn't hesitate. He ordered the young officer executed, but not quietly, not distantly. He forced Frederick to watch. Accounts differ on the exact details, but the trauma was undeniable. Some say Frederick fainted, others that he wept uncontrollably. Some claim he never forgave his father. What is clear is that after Katte's death, Frederick changed. He complied. He became the man his father demanded, but not without cost. When Frederick finally took the throne, he reinvented Prussia as a disciplined, modern, militaristic state. He won wars, reformed the bureaucracy, and became a figure of Enlightenment monarchism. But he never married. He lived much of his life surrounded by male companions and kept up an intimate, lifelong correspondence with several male friends, most notably the philosopher Voltaire. And in his private writings, brief flashes of longing emerge. One poem, attributed to Frederick, refers to a beautiful boy who haunts my dreams. Another describes love as a hidden fire, which must never burn too bright. Modern biographers continue to debate his sexuality, parsing letters, relationships, and silences. But the story of Catti looms over everything, a reminder that before Frederick was great, he was once a boy who lost everything for the crime of wanting something his world refused to name. And as we move further through history, the pattern sharpens. Royal men granted absolute power, yet denied the simple freedom of affection without consequence. Which brings us next to a Bavarian king who made his entire life into a love letter to fantasy, to beauty, and to the ghosts of men who never quite loved him back. Ludwig II of Bavaria. Ludwig II was born to be a king, but he wanted to be something else entirely, an artist, a dreamer, a curator of beauty in a world increasingly allergic to sentiment. He ascended the Bavarian throne in 1864 at the age of 18 and spent the next 2 decades not ruling but retreating into opera, solitude, and an increasingly elaborate theatre of longing that defined both his legacy and his loneliness. He is remembered today, often romantically, as the fairy tale king, and for good reason. Ludwig built castles that looked like they were sketched by a fevered architect mid-dream. Neuschwanstein, his most famous creation, was less a fortress and more a sculpted hallucination turret soaring into the alpine mist, halls lined with scenes from Wagnerian operas, ceilings painted to resemble the constellations above a world Ludwig could never quite live in. But the fairy tale was hiding something, several things actually. Ludwig never married. He was briefly engaged to his cousin, Sophie Charlotte, a princess of Bavaria, but the union dissolved quietly, and neither pushed for its revival. His reasons were clear to those who knew him best. Letters, diaries, and private communications reveal a deeply sensitive man whose emotional and romantic attachments were almost exclusively directed toward men, particularly young court officials, footmen, and theatrical performers. Among the most well-documented was Richard Horneck, Ludwig's personal aide-de-camp. Their letters are rich with affection, sometimes poetic, always deeply personal. Ludwig called him my beloved, my angel, and my only joy. The language was tender, sometimes painfully so, as though Ludwig knew he was writing into a vacuum, a man too high in rank and too starved for intimacy to say what he truly meant out loud. And yet, he kept saying it anyway. To understand Ludwig's obsessions, you have to understand Wagner, the composer who, more than anyone else, gave Ludwig the vocabulary for his fantasies. Ludwig idolized Wagner, not just the man, but the mythology he created. Operas like Tristan und Isolde and Parsifal were more than entertainment for Ludwig. They were instruction manuals for feeling. He didn't just fund Wagner's work, he financed his life. Lavish palaces, commissions, debts paid off without question. Ludwig saw in Wagner a kind of spiritual guide, a man who could articulate the emotions Ludwig wasn't allowed to confess. Some scholars even suggest Ludwig was in love with Wagner himself, though Wagner, decades older, married, and far more pragmatic, seems to have exploited that affection for personal gain. Still, Ludwig persisted. He surrounded himself with handsome young men, often of lower rank, and showered them with gifts, letters, and opportunities. He gave them positions in the court. He invited them on carriage rides, late-night walks, and secluded hunting trips. Always in the background, longing, rarely consummated, often veiled in art. It's easy to dismiss this as eccentricity or to romanticize it as harmless, courtly affection, but Ludwig was not harmless, at least not politically. His increasing detachment from governance and his obsession with fantasy drew criticism from ministers who saw him as a liability. He avoided public functions. He refused to sign key documents. He spent state funds on architectural projects so elaborate they bordered on delusional. Eventually, in 1886, his cabinet acted. They declared him insane without a medical examination and deposed him. Days later, Ludwig was found dead in the shallow waters of Lake Starnberg alongside his psychiatrist under circumstances that remain deeply suspicious. Officially, it was suicide. Unofficially, it was an execution dressed up as a tragedy. Ludwig's death marked the end of an era, not just for Bavaria, but for a certain kind of monarchy, the kind that believed in beauty for its own sake. In the decades that followed, his castles became tourist attractions, his life a footnote in the larger story of German unification. But in the quiet pages of his journals and in the still echoing music he adored, Ludwig remains a king who ruled nothing, except perhaps the landscape of his own grief. And from those echoing Alps, we turn to the court of France, where love wore wigs, scandal wore perfume, and royal identity was whatever you could survive long enough to invent. Philip I, Duke of Orleans. If Ludwig II was a romantic trapped in the wrong century, Philip I of France, Duke of Orleans, was a provocateur, perfectly suited for his time. Born in 1640 as the younger brother of Louis XIV, the Sun King, Philip lived his entire life in the shadow of one of Europe's most powerful and controlling monarchs. And yet, he managed to create a persona so dazzlingly at odds with his brother's rigid grandeur that he became something like a permanent rebellion dressed in silk. Philip, known at court as Monsieur, was flamboyant, witty, and flamboyantly uninterested in pretending to be anything other than what he was, a royal man who openly loved other men. From a young age, Philip was encouraged, perhaps even pressured by his mother, Queen Anne of Austria, to adopt a more effeminate demeanor. Her reasoning was coldly strategic. She hoped it would disqualify him from competing with his brother politically. If Philip could be made too delicate for war, too refined for politics, then Louis would rule unchallenged. The result? A man who embraced femininity, fashion, and flirtation with such theatrical conviction that he practically invented the court's scandal economy. Philip wore makeup. He dressed in elaborate gowns at masquerades. He curated his circle of favourites with an eye for both wit and appearance, and he didn't hide his preferences, not even close. His most famous companion was Philippe de Lorraine, known as the Chevalier de Lorraine, a nobleman whose beauty, arrogance, and political cunning made him both beloved and feared at court. Their relationship was tempestuous, at times violent, but undeniably central to Philip's emotional life. So central, in fact, that it caused international problems. When Philip was forced to marry twice, both times to foreign princesses, the presence of the Chevalier caused diplomatic tensions. His first wife, Henrietta of England, sister to Charles II, reportedly despised the Chevalier and clashed with Philip constantly over his public favoritism. Their marriage was a battlefield of jealousy, rumour, and, eventually, tragedy. Henrietta died young under mysterious circumstances, with some at court suspecting poisoning. Philip's second marriage to Elizabeth Charlotte of the Palatinate, better known as Madame Palatine, was more pragmatic. She tolerated his lovers, and in return, he left her alone. Her voluminous letters, many of which survive, offer a rare, brutally honest account of what it meant to be a royal consort to a man in love with someone else. And yet, despite the scandals, the affairs, the outfits, and the endless gossip, Philip was immensely successful. He led French forces to victory at the Battle of Cassel. He managed his vast estates with competence. He raised his children, especially his son, the future regent of France, with more practical wisdom than many serious statesmen of the time. Which raises an uncomfortable truth. Philip's flamboyance did not undermine his ability to lead. In fact, it may have enhanced it. By embracing the role of court jester, he freed himself from the political expectations that crushed so many others, and in doing so, he outlived most of his enemies. He died in 1701, at the age of 60, leaving behind a legacy of contradiction, a man too queer for politics, yet too powerful to ignore, a royal who turned scandal into armor. A brother who never ruled, but always reigned over fashion, over gossip, over the private loyalties of a court obsessed with appearances. And as we follow that thread, we arrive at a figure who shattered even more categories, a soldier, diplomat, and royal spy who lived as both a man and a woman, and whose gender identity was not just performance, but policy. Chevalier d'Eon. If the 18th century had a patron saint of ambiguity, it was surely the Chevalier d'Eon, a French diplomat, soldier, spy, and courtier who lived the first half of their life as a man and the second half as a woman, leaving behind a legacy so saturated in secrecy and scandal that no historian has ever truly untangled it. Born Charles Geneviève Louis Auguste André Timothée d'Eon de Beaumont, a name as long as the résumé d'Eon, began life in Burgundy in 1728, assigned male at birth, and rose swiftly through the intellectual and diplomatic circles of Louis XV's France. From an early age, d'Eon was brilliant, a master of law, literature, languages, and fencing. And it wasn't long before the crown noticed. They entered the secret du Roi, the shadowy intelligence network of King Louis XV, tasked with conducting covert missions independent of the state's official diplomacy. It was within this world of encrypted letters, invisible ink, and cross-border espionage that d'Eon's fluid identity first began to emerge not as a private choice, but as tactical necessity. According to d'Eon, during an undercover mission to Russia in the 1752nd, they disguised themselves as a woman to gain access to Empress Elizabeth's inner court, posing as Leah de Beaumont, a lady-in-waiting. Whether this story is fact, embellishment, or metaphor has long been debated, but it's one of the earliest known moments where d'Eon used gender presentation as a political tool. Not his costume, but his camouflage. Upon returning to France, d'Eon continued to serve both the crown and the military, this time as a male soldier during the 7 Years' War, earning the title Chevalier for their bravery at the Battle of Ulster. Later appointed as a diplomat in London, d'Eon flourished in England's elite circles, charming courtiers, exchanging coded dispatches, and quietly storing state secrets for personal insurance. But it was in London that d'Eon's identity became both a curiosity and a weapon. By the 1772nd, rumours were swirling through the salons of Europe. Was the Chevalier really a woman? d'Eon neither confirmed nor denied the speculation, but began leaning into it, wearing increasingly androgynous clothing, adopting feminine affectations, and ultimately demanding that Louis XVI recognize Dion officially as a woman. The king agreed, but only on the condition that Dion would henceforth dress and live exclusively as a woman, even mandating an official wardrobe pension to supply gowns. And so, the Chevalier returned to France in a state of gender transition by royal decree. It was unprecedented. This wasn't just a personal transformation. It was a government-sanctioned shift in identity, written into diplomatic records, stitched into budgets, and debated at court. The Chevalier Dion had become a living contradiction. A decorated military hero who now wore corsets and wigs, a royal spy whose body was both public spectacle and state asset. But Dion's later years were marked not by glory, but by poverty. After the French Revolution, the royal pension was suspended, and Dion, now elderly and increasingly ill, was stranded in England, forced to participate in fencing demonstrations and publish memoirs to survive. Still, the public remained fascinated, with bets placed at London clubs on whether Dion was truly male or female. It wasn't until death in 1810 that the answer came. An autopsy revealed that Dion had male anatomy. But by then, it barely mattered. Dion had lived half a century as a woman, served as both man and woman in warfare and diplomacy, and redefined what royalty-adjacent identity could look like. Chevalier Dion wasn't simply a curiosity of gender history. They were a living challenge to every rigid category monarchy relied on. Their life blurred lines between loyalty and self-interest, identity and disguise, honor and performance. And from the fluid to the repressed, we now move east to a Persian court, where sexuality was so tightly guarded by dynastic control that what survived was not confession, but rumor, one man's desires buried beneath the velvet of Safavid politics. Ismail II of Persia. The Safavid dynasty of Persia didn't just rule, they choreographed. Every gesture, robe and whisper in court was a deliberate performance of power, loyalty and piety, which made Ismail II, who reigned briefly from 1576 to 1577, a deeply unsettling presence, not because of what he did openly, but because of what everyone feared he might do secretly. Ismail II was the son of Shah Tahmasp I, a long-reigning and deeply religious monarch who stabilized the Safavid state after years of brutal wars. In contrast, Ismail was volatile, erratic, and almost immediately controversial. His path to the throne had been carved through prison walls. He had spent nearly 2 decades confined, under house arrest, suspected of being too dangerous to trust. When his father died, Ismail seized power fast and with a vengeance. His first act was to clean house, executing his own brothers and dozens of nobles, turning the palace into a blood-soaked chessboard. But beneath the political brutality lay something else, a personal life that courtiers didn't dare discuss openly, but which they never stopped whispering about. Several chroniclers, particularly those writing later under the Qajar and Safavid revival periods, make cryptic references to Ismail's unorthodox preferences, his alleged infatuation with male courtiers, and his passions that defied the accepted codes of royal conduct. These weren't observations, they were accusations. In the deeply religious framework of 16th century Persia, royal sexuality was not a private matter. It was an extension of divine favor. A sultan who strayed too far from orthodoxy, whether in politics or pleasure, risked not just scandal, but theological condemnation. So the chroniclers couched their concerns in euphemisms. He spent too much time in the baths. He preferred the company of certain attendants. He was often seen with favorites who had no formal rank. In court poetry, these rumors became mythologized. Ismail's relationships with young men, if they ever truly occurred, were cast in shadowed metaphors. The beloved is never named. The eyes that haunt him are never gendered. But the implication was clear enough for those who knew how to read between the lines. And yet, for all the speculation, Ismail never confirmed nor denied the rumors. He ruled briefly, erratically, violently, and then was dead. Poisoned, most likely, by his own sister, who feared he was veering too far from both the political and spiritual mandates of the Safavid state. In the end, Ismail II left no children, no legacy, no dynasty. Just a brief reign steeped in terror and a handful of ambiguous references in official records. But those ambiguities tell a story of their own. They tell us that even in the most tightly controlled monarchies, desire still leaves a mark, that even when erased, edited, and buried, it still haunts the text. And it's that haunting that brings us next to a country where courtly love between men wasn't whispered, it was celebrated, painted, and immortalized in masks and no stages. Next stop, Japan, where a shogun and a playwright redefined beauty, power, and the performative language of affection. Ashikaga Yoshimitsu. When Ashikaga Yoshimitsu took power as shogun in 1368, he was just 10 years old, a political puppet placed atop a military regime fractured by civil war. Japan was in the middle of the Nanboku-cho period, a time when two rival imperial courts claimed legitimacy. The Ashikaga shogunate ruled in the name of the northern court, but power was fragmented, fragile, and highly performative. Yoshimitsu, still a child, was expected to be ornamental, symbolic, obedient, temporary. He didn't agree. By his early 20s, Yoshimitsu had consolidated power so effectively that even the emperor relied on him. He negotiated peace between the warring courts, brought rebellious warlords to heel, and built the political backbone of the Muromachi shogunate. But alongside the military pragmatism and administrative reforms, Yoshimitsu fostered a cultural explosion, a golden age of aesthetics, ritual, and spectacle. And at the center of this theatrical revival was a very particular form of love. Among the various gifts, Yoshimitsu left Japan temples, gardens, and diplomatic breakthroughs. One of his most enduring legacies is his relationship with a young playwright and actor named Zeami Motokiyo. Zeami wasn't born to royalty. He was the son of Kanami, a talented but socially marginal actor in the rising tradition of No theatre, a genre that combined dance, music, and poetic drama with strict stylization and symbolic movement. Kanami introduced No to the upper classes, but it was Zeami who transformed it into an art form worthy of courtly reverence. And it was Yoshimitsu who noticed him. One performance changed everything. Zeami, still a teenager, captivated the shogun with his elegance, intelligence, and presence. Historical records make it clear, Yoshimitsu didn't just enjoy the performance, he fixated on the performer. He invited Zeami to court, took him under his patronage, and, over time, elevated him to a status that no other No actor had ever achieved. What followed wasn't a casual relationship between artist and sponsor. It was a deep, emotional, and intellectual entanglement documented in poetry, court gossip, and Zeami's own writings. Yoshimitsu became Zeami's patron, protector, and according to many scholars, his lover. In medieval Japan, male-male relationships, particularly between a powerful adult and a beautiful adolescent or young man, were not only accepted but ritualized. The practice, known as wakashudo, or the way of youths, was structured, often involving mentorship, aesthetics, and spiritual refinement. It wasn't framed as scandal, it was part of samurai culture. But Yoshimitsu and Zeami's bond wasn't typical. It crossed not only lines of class and social expectation but of permanence. While most Wakashudo relationships faded as the younger partner aged out of desirability, Zeami remained central to Yoshimitsu's world well into adulthood. Their partnership created not just a private affection, but a public cultural revolution. Under Yoshimitsu's protection, Zeami wrote dozens of no plays that are still performed today. He elevated the art form to something spiritual, infusing Buddhist philosophy into ghost stories, metaphysics into warrior tales, and behind many of those stories was a man writing for an audience of one. Yoshimitsu gave Zeami status, access, and something rare, artistic legitimacy. But the exchange wasn't one-sided. Zeami gave Yoshimitsu more than entertainment. He gave him a legacy, something softer, more enduring than the harsh architecture of war and governance. When Yoshimitsu died in 1408, he left behind the Kinkakuji, the Golden Pavilion, one of Japan's most iconic temples. But, perhaps more importantly, he left behind a story that defied both class and chronology, a military ruler and a stage performer, tangled together in ambition, love, and performance. It was a relationship that Japan never officially condemned, but never comfortably celebrated either. And in that silence, a pattern emerges again. Because across the sea, another ruler was rising in a castle filled with secrets. He, too, would rule with unquestioned power. He, too, would surround himself with beautiful boys, trained in etiquette and silence. And he, too, would leave behind a reign defined as much by private appetite as public discipline. Tokugawa Iemitsu. The Tokugawa shogunate was not built for vulnerability. It was a system of cold precision, designed to smother dissent, regulate behavior, and control even the smallest aspects of Japanese life, from the color of clothing to the arrangement of a rice bowl. And yet, at the very center of that machine, sat Tokugawa Iemitsu, the third shogun of the dynasty, ruling from 1623 to 1651, a man remembered for both his ruthlessness and his contradictions. He enforced the policy of sakoku, the complete closure of Japan's borders to foreigners, a move so absolute that it would remain in place for over 2 centuries. He centralized military authority, reinforced the caste system, and elevated the shogunate to near-imperial levels of influence. Outwardly, Iemitsu was a figure of strict control. Privately, he was anything but. Within the confines of Edo Castle, Iemitsu curated a court of male favorites known as wakashu, adolescent attendants selected not just for their obedience but for their appearance. These boys were trained in poetry, dance, and martial arts, and were expected to serve the shogun in both public and private life. The practice of nanshoku male-male relationships within the samurai class was not considered taboo in Tokugawa Japan. In fact, it was embedded in the literature, religious texts, and even military manuals of the time. Iemitsu's relationships with his wakashu were not shocking to his peers. What was shocking, however, was how unapologetically central they were to his reign. One attendant, in particular, captured Iemitsu's attention, Tsunashige, a youth from a noble family whose closeness to the shogun was so intense that it threatened the careful hierarchy of the court. Rumors swirled about the favors he received, the political influence he was allowed to wield, and the jealousy he provoked among the older daimyo. Iemitsu didn't care. He constructed elaborate rituals around his favorites. Poems were exchanged, dances performed, letters written in an ink of both formality and affection. The shogun's feelings weren't secret, they were stylized, ritualized, and folded into the broader tapestry of court life. It was power expressed not through repression, but through aesthetics. And yet, for all his indulgences, Iemitsu was still terrifying. He executed dissenters, he exiled Christians, he imposed laws so strict that entire families could be punished for the mistakes of one. His softness was reserved for the private theatre of the inner court. To the outside world, he was absolute, a man whose appetite was not for scandal, but for total control, even over his own contradictions. When he died in 1651, the court carefully edited his image. The relationships were not erased, but muffled, reframed, domesticated into footnotes. The shogunate would not celebrate the fact that its most powerful early leader built his court around boy lovers, but it couldn't quite deny it either. What survives is the tension. The same tension that echoes across royal history, between private longing and public power, between sanctioned tradition and unspoken truths. Iemitsu didn't break the rules of his world, he simply enforced them in public and rewrote them in private. And from Japan's rigid castles, we now shift to a figure whose empire was neither rational nor rigid, but mythic, where love and legacy were intertwined with legend, and every battle was fought not just on the field, but within the heart. Because next is a conqueror who reshaped the known world, and yet could not imagine it without one man by his side, Alexander the Great. Conquerors are often remembered for what they destroyed: cities leveled, kingdoms overrun, cultures swallowed by force. Alexander the Great, by contrast, is remembered for what he built: an empire that stretched from Macedonia to the edges of India, a myth that endured for over 2,000 years, and a bond so deep, so haunting, that it remained the emotional core of his life long after the man he loved was gone. Alexander wasn't born to be ordinary. Tutored by Aristotle, trained in warfare by age 12, crowned by 20, and a global legend by 30, his life reads more like myth than biography. But within that myth, quietly pulsing beneath the marble statues and gilded war accounts, is the name Hephaestion. Hephaestion wasn't just a general. He wasn't just a boyhood friend or a court companion. He was Alexander's second self, a man whose presence was so essential to the king's emotional stability that many ancient sources refer to them not as lovers, not as friends, but as two halves of the same soul. They were raised together, studied under the same tutors, and fought side by side in the most violent theatres of ancient warfare. Wherever Alexander marched, Hephaestion followed not in his shadow, but at his right hand. In an era where same-sex relationships between men were not uncommon but were expected to follow strict age-based and hierarchical norms, Alexander and Hephaestion defied the mold. Their bond was not a passing adolescent rite. It endured into adulthood, into the battlefield, into the political core of the empire. When Alexander married Roxana, it was a strategic alliance. When he married Statira, daughter of the defeated Persian king Darius, it was a diplomatic performance. But Hephaestion, he was not a strategy. He was devotion, raw and unadorned. And the empire knew it. Ancient historians, Arrian, Plutarch, Curtius, describe scenes where Alexander would hand over key negotiations to Hephaestion without hesitation, sometimes even deferring to his judgment. In one infamous case, when Alexander visited the tomb of Achilles, he laid a wreath on the grave and whispered that he saw himself as Achilles. Then he placed a second wreath for Hephaestion on the tomb of Patroclus. It was not subtle. And then came the fracture. In 324 BCE, Hephaestion fell ill suddenly while in Ecbatana, a major city in present-day Iran. He died shortly thereafter, possibly from a fever or complications from medical treatment. He was around 30 years old. Alexander, at the height of his conquests, at the peak of his power, broke. He refused food, refused to speak, stripped the city of decorations and ordered every public function cancelled. He had the doctor responsible for Hephaestion's care executed. He demanded divine honours for his fallen friend and commissioned a monumental funeral pyre said to rival the Great Pyramid in scale. For months, he wandered through his empire like a man possessed, unable to grieve properly, because grief required acceptance, and Alexander simply could not accept that Hephaestion was gone. He never recovered. Less than a year later, in Babylon, Alexander died. He was 32. Some believe it was poison. Others say malaria or typhoid. But there's a simpler explanation: his heart stopped working when its other half vanished. Their love was never framed explicitly in ancient texts. No diary entries confessing desire, no scandalous accusations from political enemies, just the kind of loyalty and grief that makes silence louder than words. Alexander's empire fragmented almost immediately after his death, divided among generals who had neither his vision nor his emotional gravity. The cities he named after himself still stand. His legends live on. But the most enduring part of his story may be the one ancient historians had no idea how to explain: that the greatest conqueror in history may have been, above all else, a man in love. And if that sounds like the end of a tragic epic, brace yourself. Because next comes another emperor, one who rewrote the Roman Empire's expectations of marriage and masculinity, not with philosophy or poetry, but with 2 weddings to 2 men. Emperor Nero. The Roman Empire has no shortage of decadent, controversial, and morally polarizing emperors. But few wore their contradictions as brazenly as Nero. He ruled from 54 to 68 CE, and depending on which historian you believe, he was either a cultural patron who brought music and art to the imperial stage, or a deranged tyrant who burned his own capital for aesthetic reasons. Most likely, he was both. But underneath the fire, scandal, and operatic narcissism lies a far stranger story. Nero was married, twice, to men. Let's rewind. Nero's early reign was deceptively stable. He inherited the throne at 17 and spent the first few years as a puppet for his mother Agrippina and a cadre of advisors. But once he gained confidence and eliminated a few inconvenient relatives, he began crafting a world that reflected only his desires. Nero fancied himself a performer emperor. He sang, acted, and played the lyre on public stages, scandalizing the aristocracy. He believed himself a divine artist and surrounded himself with anyone willing to applaud on cue. Enter Sporus. Sporus was a young boy of exceptional beauty, introduced to Nero's court after the emperor had his wife Poppaea allegedly killed in a fit of rage. Guilt-ridden or simply unable to let go, Nero had Sporus castrated, dressed in imperial robes, and married him in a public ceremony. He called him Poppaea, treated him as empress, and travelled with him across the empire. At banquets, Sporus sat beside him in full regalia. In parades, he was paraded like a bride. Nero declared that the Roman gods had sent him a second chance, this time in male form. And just to clarify, no one in the Senate was buying this as a metaphor. It was exactly what it looked like. But it didn't stop there. Nero also married a man named Pythagoras, this time flipping the roles. Nero played the bride. In another public ceremony, he wore a veil, went through Roman wedding rituals, and declared himself the spouse of another man. Witnesses described the ceremonies in stunned, sometimes horrified detail, but no one could stop him. He was emperor. He could turn scandal into spectacle with a single decree. The Roman elite were mortified. Roman society tolerated same-sex relations under strict hierarchies active. Older male citizens could have relations with lower-status men, as long as dominance was maintained. But marriage? Emotional parity? A Roman emperor submitting to another man, even in symbolic ritual? Unthinkable. And yet, Nero didn't care. He wasn't trying to scandalize Rome. He was trying to rewire it, turning the empire into a stage play, a musical, a love story that made sense only in his own head. His relationships weren't only personal, they were performative, designed to merge power with desire, history with fantasy. Of course, the empire eventually rebelled. Nero's reign ended in 68 CE, with widespread revolts and betrayal from his own guard. Fleeing the capital, he took his own life, reportedly uttering the famous last words, "What an artist dies in me." Sporus survived him, only to be passed between Roman elites as a kind of living curiosity. His story ends tragically pressured to perform in a gladiatorial mockery of a wedding. He took his own life before the show could begin. But his legacy, and Nero's lives on, in the uncomfortable margins of Roman history, proof that even in the most disciplined hierarchical societies, desire has a way of stealing the script. And next, we stay in the Han dynasty, but leap backward in time to an emperor whose court was filled with warriors and generals, and whose heart belonged not to the empire, but to the beautiful men who rode at his side into legend. Emperor Wu of Han. There are rulers who build empires and rulers who build myths. Emperor Wu of Han, reigning from 141 to 87 BCE, did both, and then some. Known as one of the most powerful and culturally influential emperors in Chinese history, he expanded the borders of the Han dynasty further than any of his predecessors. Under his rule, China stretched its influence into Central Asia, Korea, and beyond. He centralized power, standardized currency, elevated Confucianism to state ideology, and commissioned monumental infrastructure. But behind the grandeur and military brilliance of Emperor Wu stood a quieter, softer legacy, one that's often lost beneath the gold leaf pages of history books. Because for all the conquests and reforms, Wu's court was just as famous, if not more so, for its culture of beauty, male companionship, and emotional intimacy with men. To understand Emperor Wu's private court, you have to start with his fascination with young, talented men who weren't always warriors or ministers, but artists, dancers, singers, and in many cases, companions chosen as much for their physical beauty as for their charm. Among the most well-known were Han Yan, Wei Qing, and Huo Kubing, two of whom were generals, and one a personal favorite whose career soared under Wu's generous eye. Let's begin with Wei Qing. Wei Qing came from humble origins, a stable boy at the palace. But he caught the attention of Wu through familial connections. His sister was one of Wu's consorts, and through his own quiet charisma. Wu promoted him quickly, not just as an administrator, but eventually as a top military commander. Under Wu's reign, Wei Qing led successful campaigns against the Xiongnu, securing critical victories that cemented Han dominance in the north. But more than his battlefield successes, Wei Qing's proximity to the emperor was what kept courtiers whispering. The two spent increasing time together. Wu lavished him with promotions, wealth, titles. Historians speculated about the nature of their bond, often cloaking their curiosity in phrases like intimate favor or unusual affection. Some texts suggest the emperor would dine with Wei Qing privately, without attendance, an unheard of intimacy for an emperor known for protocol. And then there was Huo Kubing, Wei Qing's nephew, tall, striking, fearless in battle, and barely out of adolescence when he began rising through the ranks. Like his uncle, Huo Kubing received near unprecedented favor from the emperor. He was promoted to general by the age of 18 and became a war hero before he was old enough to legally drink tea with the senior court officials. Emperor Wu's affection for Huo was legendary. He referred to him as the boy who rides the wind, a phrase more poetic than political. When Huo died young at just 24, the emperor reportedly mourned him with a level of grief he rarely showed, even for blood relatives. He ordered a grand tomb constructed in his honor, styled like a military fortress, symbolizing both his youth and glory. None of these relationships were officially categorized as romantic. No love letter survived. No court trials aired the details. But when you read between the bamboo slips, the picture emerges. A ruler who found solace, not in marriage alliances or imperial concubines, but in the company of young men whose beauty, loyalty, and brilliance helped soften the harsh edges of ruling a vast empire. And perhaps more importantly, Wu institutionalized that culture. He created roles within the court specifically for male attendants, establishing rituals and pathways that allowed these relationships to exist within the veneer of Confucian order. These weren't secret liaisons, they were part of the palace system, normalized, yet never quite spoken aloud. Later, Confucian scholars would attempt to erase or reinterpret these dynamics. Some cast Wu's male favorites as corrupting influences, distractions from duty. Others ignored them entirely. But the story survived in poetry, in euphemism, in the way future emperors constructed their own courts full of musicians and favorites who just happened to be strikingly youthful and unusually well compensated. Wu's reign was long and complex. He died at age 69, having outlived most of his companions. His legacy was one of consolidation, cultural flourishing, and iron-fisted state control. But in the shadows of that legacy stands a softer truth. Even the mightiest of emperors carved space in the bureaucracy for affection, however veiled. And from these veils and rituals, we now travel west to a civilization that turned power into performance and masculinity into mosaic, where statues of gods looked suspiciously like court favorites, and emperors sought out not just admiration, but adoration from the beautiful, the brilliant, and sometimes the deeply unwilling. Louis XIII of France and Louis, Count of Vermandois. It is often said that the French royal court ran on protocol, perfume, and performance. By the time of the Bourbons, the monarchy was a theatrical machine, with every gesture choreographed and every whisper weaponized. But even within this world of powdered wigs and passive aggression, the topic of homosexuality among royals was a whisper too sharp to ignore. Let's start with Louis XIII, father of the Sun King. Louis XIII ruled from 1610 to 1643, and while his public reign was marked by alliances, war with Spain, and his partnership with Cardinal Richelieu, his private life was far more mysterious and emotionally fraught. Married to Anne of Austria, their relationship was, in a word, strained. For over 20 years, they failed to produce an heir, an issue of significant political anxiety. Eventually, Louis XIV was born, but rumors abounded. Some whispered that the child was conceived through artificial insemination or elaborate court intervention. Others insisted Louis XIII was simply not interested in women at all. Instead, he surrounded himself with male favorites among them, Charles d'Albert, the Duke of Luynes, and later, Henri Coiffier de Rouzy, Marquis of Cinq-Mars. These weren't just friends. They were companions of emotional significance. Men Louis XIII lavished with titles, lands, and private time. The relationship with Cinq-Mars, in particular, became the subject of intense speculation. Cinq-Mars rose rapidly in court, causing jealousy and political unrest. He was elegant, charismatic, and visibly adored by the king. Richelieu, sensing danger, orchestrated his execution for treason, an event that broke Louis emotionally, leading to an even more isolated final period of his reign. Fast forward to the next generation, and the pattern repeats itself. Louis, Count of Vermandois, was the illegitimate son of Louis XIV, born from an affair with Louise de la Vallière. Raised with privilege and proximity to the royal family, Vermandois was expected to uphold the decorum of Versailles. But Versailles had its own gravitational pull, especially when it came to a secret society known as the Brotherhood of the Holy Sacrament. This wasn't a religious order. It was a social circle, a discreet network of young, often aristocratic men involved in romantic and sexual relationships with one another. Vermandois was outed as a participant, and the scandal rocked the court. Louis XIV, obsessed with royal image and masculine authority, reacted with calculated fury. He exiled his son from Versailles, stripping him of status and dispatching him to military duty in Flanders, a punishment dressed as responsibility. Within a year, Vermandois died at the age of 16, far from court, and far from the affection that had once defined his brief, glittering life. Officially, his death was from illness. Unofficially, many suspected neglect, heartbreak, or an imperial reminder that deviating from the royal script came with consequences. And so, across generations, the House of Bourbon tried and failed to keep desire in check. They cloaked it in rituals, punished it through exile, and buried it in euphemism. But it persisted. In letters, in court gossip, in the strange, melancholic legacies of kings and princes who loved in ways their world refused to name. And next, we turn toward a sultanate where power didn't just coexist with intimacy, it depended on it. A dynasty where queens were rare, but beautiful male slaves stood beside thrones, not in shame, but in glory. Qutbuddin Mubarak Shah. The Delhi Sultanate was no stranger to contradiction. Its rulers carved their names into the subcontinent with equal parts poetry and iron, tolerance and terror, piety and decadence. But none embodied contradiction more provocatively than Qutbuddin Mubarak Shah, the last ruler of the Khalji dynasty, whose short reign from 1316 to 1320 managed to collapse not just a government, but the carefully managed illusions of royal masculinity in the Islamic courts of medieval India. Mubarak Shah inherited the throne after the death of his father, Alauddin Khalji, a formidable emperor who had stretched the Sultanate's influence into the south of India and tightened its grip through brutal administrative reforms. Alauddin ruled with ambition and paranoia. He centralized authority, eliminated noble rivalries, and left behind a court that ran on discipline and fear. Mubarak, however, had different priorities. As a young prince, Mubarak had spent years in confinement, placed under surveillance, and kept far from military or administrative power. When his father died, he was freed and crowned. And what followed was a reign less about expansion and more about liberation, but not the ideological kind. Mubarak Shah began his rule with populist gestures. He released prisoners, lowered taxes, and softened many of the strict measures his father had put in place. The people welcomed it, the nobles did not. But within months, the Sultan's attention turned away from governance altogether, and toward a single man, Khsrau Khan. Khsrau Khan was no ordinary courtier. Born into a Hindu family in Gujarat, he had been captured during a military campaign as a boy and brought to the Sultanate as a slave. He was eventually converted to Islam, trained in courtly manners, and rose through the palace ranks not just through talent, but through proximity. By the time Mubarak ascended the throne, Khsrau Khan had become his favorite, a title that carried far more than ceremonial weight. Mubarak elevated him rapidly, granting him wealth, titles, and eventually military command. He referred to him as the beloved of the king, and structured his inner court around him, ignoring senior nobles, bypassing advisors, and, according to contemporary chroniclers, allowing Khsrau to dominate both his personal and political spheres. The relationship caused immediate tension. While male-male companionship and affection were not uncommon in Islamic courts, often ritualized and even poeticized, public displays of favoritism that threatened the political balance were something else entirely. Historians differ in their interpretations. Some Persian chroniclers writing under later dynasties portray Mubarak as weak, indulgent, and corrupted by lust. Others suggest he was simply in love, perhaps for the first time, and acted as any monarch intoxicated by power and affection might, recklessly. But it wasn't just Mubarak's affection for Khsrau that threatened the throne. It was his trust. In a move that seemed more romantic than rational, Mubarak began transferring serious administrative and military power to Khsrau. He appointed him commander of key forces and placed him in charge of palace security. Critics at court began murmuring about what they saw as a dangerous imbalance. A king ruled by his own indulgence, and a former slave whose ambitions were growing bolder by the day. And then, one night, in 1320, it ended. Khsrau Khan assassinated Mubarak Shah in a carefully orchestrated palace coup. He murdered the very man who had raised him up, protected him, and perhaps loved him most. With the king dead, Khsrau declared himself Sultan, becoming the first and only ruler of the short-lived Barha dynasty. His reign would last just a few months. The nobles, still bitter over Mubarak's favoritism, rallied behind another military leader, Ghiyath al-Din Tughlaq, who overthrew Khsrau in a violent counter-coup. Khsrau was executed and the official narrative rewritten. Mubarak was painted as a foolish ruler corrupted by personal weakness, and Khsrau as a treacherous seducer. But beneath the moralizing and political propaganda, there's a subtler story. Qutbuddin Mubarak Shah was not destroyed by love or even betrayal. He was destroyed by a system that refused to allow emotional intimacy and political legitimacy to coexist, especially when that intimacy violated unspoken codes of masculinity and hierarchy. In many ways, he was a tragic figure, a man born into a throne, unprepared for its loneliness, and undone by the very person who offered him relief from it. His reign is rarely remembered fondly. Historians dismiss it as a moment of instability between stronger dynasties. But in the margins, among the lines of chronicles written by disapproving scribes, we find a haunting portrait of a ruler who lost everything not because he broke the rules of empire, but because he broke the rules of attachment. And now, we leave the power corridors of the Delhi Sultanate for the haunted gardens of Castile, where love once again blurred the boundary between grief and obsession, where the dead were never truly gone, and the royal bed was never truly empty.